Imagine this. You're outside at night, mug in hand, the kind of quiet where even the crickets sound shy. Above you, the sky is doing its usual perfect impression of forever. And then a thought sneaks in playful, a little ridiculous, the way good ideas often arrive. What if that new interstellar visitor everyone's whispering about 3IATLAS didn't just wander in? What if, in some sideways cosmic way, we called it? Not with trumpets or a welcome mat. With the little things we do without thinking. A century of songs and ball games bleeding into space. Radar pings, spacecraft hellos, the soft electronic heartbeat of a planet that learned to speak in signals. What if the universe heard our background noise and, like a neighbor catching laughter through the wall, leaned closer? Tonight, we're not here to prove anything or sell a scare. We're here to wonder gently, to let a wild possibility sit beside us like a friendly cat. Could humanity have triggered a traveler from deep between the stars? If we did, what does that say about us? About the kind of story we're telling without meaning to? No homework, no formulas, no tangled jargon. Just a slow conversation under a big sky, where mystery is allowed to breathe and answers are invited to take their time. Get comfortable. Let the day's edges soften. We'll follow this thread together. Half smile, half goosebumps, and see where it leads. If there's a message in all this, maybe it isn't be afraid. Maybe it's simply, you were heard. Picture a dark lake at night. You toss a pebble without thinking, and a few seconds later, there it is, another ripple comes back from somewhere out there. Not yours, but answering. That's the feeling behind tonight's idea. For about a century, we've been tossing pebbles into the cosmic water. Radio shows, radar pings, spacecraft whispers, even a gold record bolted to a robot. The question we're holding is simple and a little bit mischievous. Could one of those ripples have coaxed a traveler into our pond? Start with what we've actually done. When people say, we've been talking to space, they don't mean we booked a call with aliens. Mostly, we leaked. Early radio and TV towers sprayed signals upward, like streetlights, throwing glow into fog. That spillover has been racing outward at light speed, forming what scientists casually call our radio bubble, a sphere of faint human-made noise, now roughly 100+ light years in radius. It isn't a tidy broadcast. It's a messy collage. Baseball play-by-plays, breaking news from decades ago, static, music, and the clean, sharp blips of radar. Two kinds of signals matter in this story. First, the unintentional ones. Leakage, the background chatter of a technological species that hadn't yet learned to whisper. Second, the deliberate ones, bottles we threw into the deep on purpose. In the 1970s, the Arecibo Observatory aimed a 3-minute burst toward a star cluster, packing math and simple pictures into 1,679 bits. That number's the product of 2 primes. A little wink to say, arrange me this way. The Voyager golden records, launched around the same time, or more like time capsules. Greetings, music, and a sonic postcard from a blue world that hoped someone might someday listen. Carl Sagan used to warn, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But he also liked to say that sending these artifacts was an act of hope. That's the energy we're playing with tonight, hope, not proof. If something did arrive, how would we know whether our ripple triggered it? Trigger is a tricky word. It might mean the literal cause our signal reached someone. They noticed and sent a reply. But it could mean something gentler. Our growing noise nudged a decision already on the table. Or it could be humbler still. Our better telescopes triggered more discoveries. Maybe the visitors were always out there. We just finally learned to see. Let's get our terms straight without putting anyone to sleep. An interstellar object is simply a rock, ice ball, or something stranger that isn't bound to the sun. Its path through our neighborhood is a one-time swing by, like a tourist changing planes who never planned to stay. We've seen at least 2 for real. 1I Oumuamua in 2017, which looked like a sliver and behaved oddly enough to spark lively debate, and 2I Borisov in 2019, a very normal-looking comet that made astronomers sigh with relief because it fit the book. A hypothetical 3IATLAS would be the third such visitor, named for the survey that found it, as is the custom. If you hear ATLAS, that's the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System robotic eyes sweeping the sky for anything fast and new, the way a lifeguard scans waves for a head where there shouldn't be one. So scenario 1, the fun one, we were heard. We've been lighting up a quiet patch of the radio spectrum, nicknamed the waterhole. Think of it as the calm lane in a cosmic highway, the frequencies near the natural emissions of hydrogen and hydroxyl, pieces of water. It's a clever spot to listen, because the universe itself is relatively quiet there. If someone out there watched our patch of sky, they could notice a little planet that shouts sometimes. Our brightest moments aren't sitcoms. They're planetary radar-focused, megawatt pings we fired at Venus, the Moon, and passing asteroids to map them. Those beams are like lighthouse sweeps. If you were a patient eavesdropper on a nearby star, you might say, "Ah, whoever's there uses technology. Let's take a look." Now, it's important to be honest about distance and power. Most TV and radio leakage fades into noise after just a few light years. The inverse square law: imagine a flashlight. Double the distance, and the glow spreads to a quarter of its brightness. Doesn't cut us much slack. But the big, tight beams we sometimes use? Those stand out. If there's a listener with a good ear in the neighborhood, say, within a few dozen light years, our pebbles are not invisible. Scenario 2, the modest one. We didn't summon anything. We just finally noticed. Surveys like ATLAS, Pan-STARRS, ZTF, and soon the Virus C, Rubin Observatory have made us better at catching fast movers. It's like switching from a blurry webcam to a 4K camera. You suddenly discover more birds at the feeder. Did the birds change? No, your eyes did. In that sense, our curiosity triggered discovery the way cleaning your glasses triggers detail. Nothing strange about that, and it explains a lot without creating a mystery we then have to solve. Scenario 3, the middle path. We were a factor among many. The galaxy is not empty. It's a traffic network of ice and stone nudged by stars, tides, and time. Every so often, a shard from far away threads our solar system by chance. If a civilization out there also pays attention to the waterhole, our loudest years may have moved their curiosity needle from someday to let's do it. That's not magic. It's timing. You see a porch light come on in a distant cabin. Maybe you decide to walk over. You were already hiking. The light just made the choice easier. A quick pit stop in definitions, promised without paying. The hydrogen line is a particular radio note. Emitted by hydrogen, the universe's most common element, when the electron flips its magnetic alignment relative to the proton. It happens at 1420.405 megahertz. If you're building a universal meet me here, sign for radio-using species, this note is your never-changes lighthouse. SETI projects listen there a lot because it's both meaningful and usually quiet. Okay, back to the question. If 3IATLAS shows up and we want to test the "we triggered it" idea responsibly, what would count as a nudge toward yes? A few things, none, a slam dunk. All interesting in combination. A rival direction that lines up with star systems that would have hurt us at the right times. Trajectories that cluster more than random chance would expect. Radio behavior that seems conversational, simple math, and slightly more complex patterns, a kind of "we see you" handshake. And still, we'd have to be careful, because humans are pattern hungry. Give us clouds, and we'll find dragons. Here's where a gentle distinction helps. Correlation isn't causation, but it is a place to look. If several interstellar visitors in a short window approach from a patch of sky that, decades earlier, we lit up with our brightest beams, that's a correlation. It could be coincidence. It could be selection bias. We look harder where we expect fruit, and surprise, we find fruit. Or it could be meaningful. As one astronomer said after a close call with a false alarm, you can't let your wishful thinking write the paper. Let's widen the lens. Trigger could also mean something physical we did, like radar, actually pushing on an object. That's where we draw a line. Our radio energy is laughably tiny compared to sunlight and gravity. It can't torque a city block-sized object across interstellar space. So if 3IATLAS moves oddly accelerates a whisper without a visible tail, there are plausible natural reasons. Ice is venting like a comet turned inside out, or sunlight pressure on a very thin, very reflective surface. That last one fuels the light sail daydream, a technology we can build in principle and have tested in small ways. But jumping from thin and bright to alien craft is a bridge too far unless the thing starts doing math at us. And what if it does? The first hello any cautious species would send is numbers. Prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7 are a classic. They're universal, not tied to a language or culture. It's basically the cosmos tapping out. I can count. Can you? If a faint tone near the hydrogen line starts stepping through primes, repeating, pausing, and returning in a way that tracks the object's motion, astronomers perk up. If different observatories on different continents see the same behavior, the eyebrow goes higher. And if, layered on top, the timing encodes something like a simple diagram, well, then you have the beginnings of a conversation. Begin at math, as one SETI veteran likes to say, and end wherever courage allows. There's a softer version of triggering we should honor too. The way our curiosity pulled whole systems into existence surveys, networks, shared software, so we could notice more of the universe. Socially, that matters. A sleepy radio observatory becomes a pilgrimage site. A high school physics club starts tuning cheap software-defined radios to the hydrogen line just to listen to the quiet. A telescope live stream picks up 10,000 viewers on a Tuesday night because someone whispers, "Tonight might be the night." We trigger ourselves into paying attention, into learning together, into asking better questions. Of course, a little humility helps the tea go down. The universe loves to prank us. In 1967, a regular blip in the radio sky looked so precise that the discoverers privately nicknamed it LGM-1, Little Green. Men, it was the first pulsar, a neutron star, not a neighbor. In 1977, a 72-second signal near the hydrogen line made one astronomer scrawl, "Wow," in the margin. It never repeated. To this day, it sits in the cabinet labeled maybe, which is science's way of saying not enough to call. So how do you play with a wild idea without getting lost? You do what good detectives do. You collect independent lines of evidence. You publish your methods. You let skeptics kick the tires. You celebrate being wrong because it means your net didn't catch a shadow. And you leave a little space, always for wonder. As Sagan's caution reminds us, the burden of proof climbs with the size of the claim. But curiosity is allowed to walk ahead, lantern in hand, as long as integrity follows close behind. Let's imagine the friendliest version of events. Our century of signals passes through a quiet neighborhood. Someone there keeps a sky log, the way we once kept ship logs. A note goes in the margin. Faint, structured radio from Sol 3 direction. Revisit. Years go by for them. Decades for us. Their decision isn't dramatic. No armada. No city-sized craft. Just a small, durable traveler tossed our way. The interstellar equivalent of sending a postcard before knocking on the door. It doesn't need to land. It doesn't need to risk anything. It just needs to pass close enough that our clumsy species can see it and say out loud, "We are not imagining this." And if the answer is the simple one, no message, no intention, just a shard of alien ice doing nothing more than obeying gravity and heat, that's still a gift, because even then, the timing is telling us something about us. We asked better questions, so the sky gave us better puzzles. We built better tools, so the universe felt a little less silent. Sometimes the meaning of a coincidence is that you were finally awake enough to notice it, and that can be enough to change a life. There's one last, quiet layer to trigger that I can't shake. When people learn to look up together, to text a friend and say, "Go outside," you can see it now. We triggered something communal. The same way ocean towns wander out at low tide to watch bioluminescence, we gathered around the hydrogen line and listened for math. That social act may be the most important signal we've sent yet. Not the watts, not the bits, but the posture. We are a species practicing attention. We are a planet learning to be a listener. So, could 3IATLAS have come because of us? Maybe. Could we have simply put ourselves in the right headspace to notice it? Absolutely. And if we did call it, even by accident, the lesson isn't about power. It's about responsibility. When you shout across a canyon and hear an echo, you don't assume a monster. You say, "Hello," a little softer this time. You learn the shape of the space by how it answers. If our ripples have finally met another ripple, no alarms. Just hands on the mug, eyes on the dark lake, a small smile. We hear you. Imagine a neighbor you've never met who suddenly texts, "Hey, just heard your music through the wall, nice taste." That's the vibe behind tonight's What If. For 100-ish years, we've been the loud apartment in an otherwise quiet building, and the universe has very patient walls. Some of what we've sent was intentional, like the Arecibo message in 1974, a 3-minute, mathematically cute postcard beamed at a star cluster, and the Golden Records riding Voyager, stuffed with greetings, whale songs, and Johnny B. Good. Most of it wasn't intentional at all. It was the electromagnetic equivalent of leaving your windows open. TV towers, AM radio, airport radar, all leaking into space at light speed. Astronomers call the result our radio bubble, not because it's fragile, but because it's expanding. Picture a sphere centered on Earth, now more than 100 light years wide, full of faint human noise. If anyone out there owns good headphones and a lot of patience, they've had time to notice the hum. The mischievous question is whether that hum could lure a traveler. Trigger sounds dramatic, as if we reached out, poked the cosmos, and it rolled over to boop us back. The sober version is gentler. Maybe our loudest moments nudged someone's curiosity, the way a porch light nudges you to walk a little closer. Or maybe nothing was lured at all, and the only thing we triggered was ourselves better telescopes, better software, better habits of looking. So now we catch visitors we used to miss. Either way, the plot is fun. A third interstellar object, informally nicknamed for the survey that spots it, cuts across our sky on a one-time solar swing. We nickname things because it's comforting. The universe names with math. We add Atlas because we like our heroes mythic. If you've heard of the first two drifters, you know the tone of the debate already. In 2017, Oumuamua arrived like a sliver of spice bark, long, thin, and acting just weirdly enough to keep graduate students caffeinated for years. Its path showed a whisper of extra push that sunlight and outgassing could maybe explain if you squinted correctly. 2 years later, 2I Borisov sailed in as a proper comet, coma and tail and all, like nature clearing its throat to say, "Relax." Most of us are normal. Put those together, and you get a tidy moral. The cosmos can be both mundane and mischievous, and the trick is not to overreact to either. So what would it even mean to trigger a newcomer? Start with the plumbing. The hydrogen line is a specific radio note hydrogen emits when the electron flips its magnetic alignment relative to the proton. It sits at 1420 megahertz, and the universe is full of it. that quiet neighborhood astronomers nicknamed the region around it the water hole, because hydrogen plus hydroxyl make water, and scientists can't resist a pun, is where you'd expect polite civilizations to hang a "meet me here" sign. Our own loudest, most concentrated shouts pass near there when we use planetary radar to ping Venus or map an asteroid. Those beams are bright, narrow, and as one radio astronomer likes to say, arrogantly obvious. Most of our TV and radio leakage fades to static a few light years out, but the big radar pulses are different. If you're sitting on a nearby star with an ear like Fast in China or the VLA in New Mexico, and you're paying attention, our lighthouse sweep would be hard to miss. That's the romantic version. The unromantic footnote is physics. Your favorite sitcom from 1979 is not blasting the Andromeda Galaxy. Signals dilute. Space is noisy. The inverse square law eats hubris for breakfast. Which is why, if someone noticed us, it was probably the focus stuff, not the chatter. That matters for timing. Our brightest radar days really kick in mid-20th century onward, which means a nearby eavesdropper who got curious could, in principle, have had decades to nudge a small, durable, low-risk messenger onto a path that intersects our solar system in the mid-2020s. That's not proof. It's a plausible storyboard, the kind you pin to a corkboard with red string, and then beg your more patient friend to check for selection bias. Now comes the part where we set down the espresso and breathe. Humans are pattern hungry. Give us cloud vapor, and we'll find a dragon, a ship, and the profile of our high school history teacher, all in the same puff. Scientists cope by making the rules boring on purpose. If a new visitor shows up, and we want to test the "did our shouting matter" idea, we'd look for a handful of sober clues that, together, lean the odds. We'd ask whether the approach directions cluster toward parts of the sky that would have received our brightest beams at the right times. We'd check whether the arrival spacing accidentally mirrors big milestones in our transmit happy timeline. We'd watch for behavior that looks more like a handshake than like geology's simple math and a steady tone near the waterhole. Something you could reproduce and verify from, say, New Mexico and South Africa on the same night. We'd also write down those tests before we stare at the data, so we can't cheat later. If you're hearing the voice of that one cautious professor in your head right now, good. That voice keeps us honest. There's a different kind of trigger baked into this story that has nothing to do with aliens and everything to do with us. Around 2010, sky surveys went from helpful to hyper. ATLAS, pan-stars, these Wiki transient facility arrays that rescan the whole sky again and again, taught us to spot fast movers automatically. Soon the Vera C. Rubin Observatory will do for the night what time-lapse does for flowers. Reveal motion we used to miss. It's no accident that the first interstellar drifters popped up only after we built better nets. The universe didn't change. As one survey scientist likes to joke, we did. In that sense, curiosity is a machine. You feed it resources and discipline, and it converts ignorance into surprise. What if a newcomer plays coy? You'd expect that. If you were cautious and kind, you wouldn't drop a megawatt monologue on a biosphere you'd never met. You'd start where any two minds with different languages can meet numbers. Prime numbers are the classic opening act. Tap out 2, 3, 5, 7 in a narrowband tone. Pause. Start again. That's a way of saying, I can count, and I know you can too, without saying anything dangerous or creepy. If we heard that near the hydrogen line, co-moving with a visitor, once is interesting, twice is thrilling, 3 times reproducible science. If nothing like that shows up, and all we see is dust and sunlight doing normal dust and sunlight things, well, that's an answer too. It says we didn't trigger a guest. We triggered a better habit of not missing them. There's a practical worry lurking under the fun, and it's worth pulling into the light. Words like summoned make people imagine. We're flipping some galactic bat signal that could call in something we're not ready to meet. The boring truth is that our leakage has already gone. You can't unring a bell that left the tower in 1955. What we can control is what we do now. The SETI crowd, which is much less spooky than movies suggest, tends to split their days between listening carefully and debating, very politely, whether purposeful messaging should be a group decision. Who speaks for Earth is more than a movie poster. It's governance. If you've ever tried to order pizza with 6 friends, you know why they haven't resolved it yet. Let's circle the lake again. Suppose our hypothetical visitor does something genuinely odd. The brightness wobbles with a period so steady it looks controlled. The thermal behavior suggests surfaces that manage heat like a lizard in the shade instead of a rock in an oven. The trajectory shows tiny course trims that don't match simple outgassing. You don't need aliens to explain any one of those. Engineers can sketch natural ways to get each quirk. Porous ices, layered crusts that vent asymmetrically, flakes thin enough for sunlight pressure to matter. But if 3 or 4 quirks line up and the radio behaves like a lesson plan, your eyebrows are allowed to rise. The mantra is merciless but fair. Extraordinary claims, extraordinary evidence. When in doubt, we publish the boring explanation first and let the spicy one fight its way in later. A short detour through humility. In 1967, Jocelyn Bell Burnell noticed pulses so regular that her team half-jokingly labeled the source LGM-1 Little Green Men 1. It was the first pulsar, a spinning cinder star with a magnetic field that could make your fillings ache from across the galaxy. In 1977, a 72-second spike near the hydrogen line made an astronomer write, "Wow," in the margin. It didn't repeat. We still don't know what it was. These stories aren't gotchas. They're guardrails. Nature can fake you out with a straight face. The best cure is not cynicism. It's patience. Now for the human part, which might be the real reason you're here at this hour. The act of paying attention together is a kind of soft technology. When a rumor that a visitor might be up tonight zips through group chats, city folks wander out onto balconies with chipped mugs. Rural folks step into dark fields with dogs who don't understand the fuss. And someone somewhere checks whether their thrift store shortwave can even hear 1420 megahertz. A radio astronomer in West Virginia cracks the window in a control room because the night smells like rain. A teenager in Nairobi writes a little program to fold prime-ish patterns out of static and tapes. A sticky note over the webcam because movies taught us to. Whatever 3IATLAS turns out to be, that moment is real. It's us practicing being a planetary audience. There's a line I like for nights like this. Begin at math. End wherever courage allows. If a newcomer whispers primes, we whisper back the way the Arecibo team did, with simple, kind numbers and a patience that costs nothing. If the newcomer is only stone and sunlight well, then we still win, because the habit is the same. We learned how to listen without crowding the stage. We learned how to be skeptical without being joyless. We learned how to keep our sense of humor. The universe is allowed to be weird without explaining itself on the first date. Could our noise have nudged a traveler into our pond? Maybe. Could we have simply gotten better at noticing ripples that were always there? Absolutely. Either way, if something passes close and we feel that tug in the ribs, the next move isn't panic. It's what you do on a quiet lake. You say hello softly. You watch for another ripple. You smile at how brave it feels to wait. Picture a quiet control room in the Chilean night, monitors humming, coffee cooling faster than the desert air. The telescope isn't glamorous, no sweeping domes or dramatic laser beams, just a hard-working set of eyes that blink every 30 seconds and ask a very simple question. Did anything move? That's the whole trick of modern sky surveys. You take one frame, then another, and you play a cosmic flipbook. Stars stay put. Interlopers betray themselves by shifting a few pixels. If they shift the right way and the right amount, you've got a story. If they shift too much, you've got a heart rate. The software does the first gasp for us. It highlights a point of light with the astronomical equivalent of a highlighter pen and says, "This one's lively." The pipeline has seen birds, planes, satellite flares, detector glitches that pretend to be drama, and 1,000 kinds of boring rocks. It is not easy to impress, but every so often, something moves against the starry backdrop in a way that doesn't fit the usual boxes. The raw numbers arrive first: position, brightness, apparent motion. Then someone somewhere types out the little haiku that astronomers send to the minor planet's center time: place, brightness, so the rest of the world can point their telescopes and check your work. Peer review, but with photons. The next step is celestial bookkeeping. You feed those fresh positions into a program that tries to draw an orbit, and the orbit replies with a personality. Eccentricity, which sounds like a character flaw in a Victorian novel, is just a measure of how stretched an ellipse is. 0 means a perfect circle. Numbers between 0 and 1 mean an ellipse, still bound to the sun. Numbers bigger than 1 mean the track isn't an ellipse at all. It's a hyperbola, a mathematical curve of a hello and goodbye. Hyperbolic orbits don't loop. They visit. When the first solution pops out with E greater than 1, even the jaded night crew leans forward. That's not ours, as one survey scientist likes to mutter, equal parts awe and dread. We've had visitors before. The first time, in 2017, the little sliver from space that we named Oumuamua acted like the cosmic equivalent of a stray cat skittish, thin, and leaving us to invent backstories. Its path was just off enough to make us argue over whether sunlight alone could explain its subtle extra push. 2 years later, 2I Borisov arrived like a textbook diagram of a comet, coma and tail and all, the teacher's pet of interstellar behavior. That one calmed everyone down. Nature can be weird, but it can also be reassuringly boring. So when a new point of light saunters in, and the math says, "Not bound," not from here, it earns a name that's half label, half folktale. We add Atlas not because the gods care, but because the survey that found it does. The naming convention is our way of saying thank you to the machines that never sleep. Now to the part that makes this episode more than a pretty orbit. Could we have tugged this traveler's attention? The timid answer is that triggered is too strong. We're not summoners with a galaxy-sized remote, but we have been noisy. For a century, we leaked radio and TV like a house with the windows open. Most of that leaks away into the cosmic hiss and becomes indistinguishable from background within a few light years. The inverse square law is ruthless. Double the distance and your signal gets 4 times fainter. Keep doubling and you learn humility very quickly. The exceptions, the parts of our voice that actually carry, are the focused, deliberate shouts. Planetary radar pings at planets and passing rocks. Megawatt lighthouses that sweep the sky when Earth rotates. Those beams are narrow and rude. If you were a patient listener in the neighborhood, a few dozen light years away, you might notice the sun blink with a pattern that screams, "Someone is mapping their yard." This matters for timing in a story sense. If a neighbor 50 light years out caught our loudest moments in, say, the 1970s through the 2000s, and if they were the kind of neighbor who answers the door with a polite wave rather than a surprise party, they could nudge a small, durable messenger onto a course that uses gravity like stepping stones. Star, interstellar medium, our sun, sling past, home again. The physics isn't magic. It's just attention, propulsion we don't have yet, and patience we rarely practice. As one radio astronomer likes to say, the speed of light is fast. The speed of decisions is slow. If something did decide to visit, the calendar would look less like a reaction and more like a chess game we didn't know we were playing. The flip side is less romantic, but just as powerful. We may not have triggered a visitor at all. We may have triggered our own competence. A decade ago, we got serious about watching the whole sky all the time, not just the pretty corners. Atlas, Pan-STARRS, the Zwicky Transient Facility. These aren't glamour telescopes. They're factory floors for discovery. Take 3 images, subtract, flag, repeat until sunrise. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory will turn that dial past 11. When you move from "we look when we feel like it" to "we look whether we feel like it or not," the universe doesn't send more guests. You just stop missing them. Still, the mind plays. If a traveler wanted to signal without spooking us, how would it act? You'd expect restraint. No fireworks, no monologues, just a simple, narrow tone near a frequency we already sanctified by our own habits. The hydrogen line 1420 MHz is popular because hydrogen is the universe's favorite element, and its spin-flip radio whisper sits in a relatively quiet neighborhood of the spectrum. Astronomers call the region around it the water hole, and do, in fact, meet there. A steady carrier near that line, drifting exactly as a co-moving source should drift, is the cosmic version of clearing your throat on a stage we already stare at. You can test that kind of thing properly. Point independent dishes from different continents. Check that the signal vanishes when you look away. Watch the frequency slide with the same Doppler shift the object's motion predicts. If all 3 happen and keep happening, you have the kind of evidence that makes even the skeptic grin. If none of them happen, and the newcomer behaves like dust that likes sunlight, that's good science too. You've ruled out your own wishful thinking. Don't fall in love with your first hypothesis. An old orbital dynamicist told me once, standing under a plotting screen littered with white arcs, "Space will break your heart and teach you patience." He meant that every cute idea needs to survive the boring tests. Does the light curve, the way the brightness rises and falls as the object spins, look like a tumbler or a panel? Do tiny course changes line up with the way a comet vents when warmed, or do they look like someone balancing a tray in a breeze? Does the thermal behavior match rock heat up, cool down, or something managing its temperature, like a lizard that knows the cost of shade? You can invent a natural way to explain any one quirk. When 3 or 4 point in the same direction, you pay attention, but you still call your friend on the other mountain and ask them to check your math. And because the universe enjoys slapstick, it keeps a drawer full of imposters. The first pulsar looked like a metronome from the heavens until we learned neutron stars do that casually. The wow signal, a 72-second shout near the hydrogen line in 1977, tempted us with drama and then ghosted us forever. Neither of those was a prank. Both taught us a lesson. Regularity can be natural, surprise can be singular, and the plural of anecdote is not data. That's why modern teams pre-register their tests. Yes, in astronomy, too, so we can't move the goalposts after we peak. When a potential third visitor threads the inner system and the E greater than 1 stamp shows up again, our reaction says as much about us as about it. Amateur radio folks dust off software-defined receivers and aim at 1420. Half for the science, half for the romance of participating. School clubs write little scripts that hunt for primish rhythms in noise. And sometimes they find only their own heating vents. And sometimes they find a teachable moment. A retired engineer in Ohio hears nothing but static for 3 weeks and keeps listening anyway. A graduate student in South Africa loses sleep to make sure her pipeline doesn't confuse satellite chatter for something cosmic. That shared attention is not trivial. Even if the punchline is comet, case closed, we got better at being the kind of species that can hear a knock. So did we trigger anything? The honest answer right now is that we learned how to ask the question without letting our excitement do the answering. We can trace the radio bubble we've blown, estimate which nearby suns could have heard our brightest lighthouses, and model what a cautious hello from there would look like when it arrives here. We can also admit that we're late to our own party and have only just hung a proper bell on the door. The universe doesn't owe us a reply, but it doesn't mind if we listen with a little style. If tonight's object is only rock and sunshine, the story is still a good one. We caught a tourist in the act of touring. If it does something extra, something that taps out 2, 3, 5, 7 while coasting past the waterhole, then we'll do what grown-up scientists do. We'll call our friends, point more dishes, write down our predictions in advance, and see if the cosmos is in the mood for a conversation that begins, as all good conversations do, with a small shared truth. Numbers first, meaning later. Courage last. Imagine the moment after discovery, when the thing has a label and an orbit that won't sit still, and the group chat that never sleeps goes from sleepy emoji to full caps punctuation. That's when the second act begins. The first act is catching the moving dot. The second is asking whether the timing tells a story, not just the motion. We like to pretend we're stoic about this, that we wait for data like monks waiting for dawn. But the truth is more human. Someone always asks, half joking, half afraid to jinx it, if a traveler really were answering us, when would they have decided to leave? To even play that game, you need 2 household ideas dressed in astronomy clothes. The first is the light year, which isn't a clock, but a tape measure. It's the distance light covers in a year, about 6 trillion miles, and it's the universe's way of saying, everything you see is a little bit late. The second is that signals fade as they spread, like a voice in a canyon that loses itself to the air. That fading follows a ruthless square law. If a baseball game broadcast is barely a whisper at a few light years, it's a rumor by 10, and silence by 50, unless you're listening with a dish the size of a mountain and a patience measured in decades. But here's the rub. Not all our shouts are equal. The old television towers were leaky porch lights. The planetary radar systems, Arecibo back when it lived, Goldstone when it flexes, are searchlights. A radar ping at Venus isn't meant for aliens. It's meant to bounce off a planet and come back home. But the beam doesn't care. It sails on in a narrow spear of megawatts, and as Earth turns, that spear sweeps a thin ring across the stars. If you were camped on a nearby sun with a proper ear, you'd see our star wink in a way stars shouldn't. You'd be forgiven for sitting up. So, the thought experiment writes itself. Suppose a neighbor 30 or 60 light years away noticed those rude winks in the 1970s or 1990. They'd need at least that long just to receive the news. Then they'd face the same boring tyranny we face. Propulsion that doesn't break physics, and navigation that doesn't trust hope. Even at 10th the speed of light, which we can barely whisper about without resorting to science fiction, still makes a decades-long voyage. Add in a few years to argue, build, test, and sigh, and you're in the ballpark where a messenger leaving back then could coast into our yard. Now, that's not proof. That's the calendar behaving suspiciously well. The danger, of course, is that calendars are very obliging when you want them to be. Humans are pattern engines. Give us a bowl of alphabet soup, and we'll swear the noodles spell omens. Statisticians muzzle that instinct with 2 unromantic phrases: selection bias and the look elsewhere effect. The first is the habit of noticing the hits and ignoring the misses. The second is what happens when you canvass a huge field of possibilities, then act surprised that something somewhere looks meaningful. It's like touring every casino in Nevada, finding one roulette table that came up black 6 times in a row, and writing a prophecy. The table didn't change, your map did. So the grown-up version of our thought experiment goes like this. We reconstruct the sphere of human radio noise, decade by decade, transmitter by transmitter, not as a proud myth, but as a power budget with beam shapes attached. We don't draw a vague circle and call it our radio bubble. We stack a century's worth of towers and radars and deep space pings and ask, at every point in the sky, what did we actually spray there? How often and how bright? Then we check which nearby suns were sitting under our loudest sweeps and when. Then, and this is the part that keeps everyone honest, we freeze the rules before we look at the visitor's direction. No massaging. No. What if we include this transmitter too? No moving the goalposts after kickoff. When you do that, the poetry gets a haircut and becomes math. Sometimes it still smiles back. You find that a few promising nearby stars really did take a direct hit from our most obnoxious radars right around the years. Their light would now be nudging our mail slot. You also find that plenty did not, that plenty of sky was whisper quiet, and that the visitor's approach doesn't sit neatly on any single guilty star like a map pin begging for a documentary voiceover. Space is messy. Trajectories curve in 3 dimensions. Tiny uncertainties at the start blossom into wide lanes at the end. If you're itching to write "the probe came from here" on a whiteboard, the universe hands you a dry erase marker and no eraser. That said, the geometry can still nudge your imagination in useful directions. A hyperbolic inbound curve is not a straight line. It's a promise to be deflected by the sun's gravity into a precise exit. If a messenger wanted to maximize our chances of noticing without risking a fender bender with Earth, it would aim for a sweet spot that lets ground-based telescopes track it for months, not days, and keeps perihelion, the closest sun-grazing moment, far enough out to avoid becoming a firework. This is the sort of target an engineer would pick: conservative, observable, testable. It also happens to be the sort of trajectory we're best at measuring, which makes theorists smile and cynics mutter. Convenient, both say, for very different reasons. We've learned to temper those moods with another unglamorous tool: registered prediction. Before the next set of data arrives, you write down what each idea expects to see. If it's natural comet stuff, you expect a faint haze when the sun warms it, a coma of gas and dust that shows up in certain wavelengths and puffs in predictable ways. If it's a thin engineered panel surfing on sunlight, you expect the brightness to change like a sheet turning in a breeze, rather than like a potato tumbling. If it's trying to talk, you expect any radio tone to drift exactly with the object's Doppler shift, not with the schedule of terrestrial satellites or microwave ovens. You publish those predictions. You let your critics sharpen their pencils, and then you open the new files. As one old hand puts it, call your shot before you swing. All of this might sound like we're draining the magic out of a delicious what if. We're not. The magic is safer when it sits on a scaffold that doesn't wobble. If a narrow whisper near the hydrogen line, the so-called water hole where the galaxy's background noise is blessedly quiet, shows up in multiple dishes on separate continents, marching in lockstep with the object's motion and vanishing when we look aside, then even the skeptics reload their coffee. If the whisper is only ever heard by one instrument, at hours suspiciously friendly to local interference, then the romantics shrug and reload theirs. Either way, the night goes on and the sky remains patient. It helps to remember that we've been tricked by the cosmos before without the cosmos meaning it. The first pulsar was so precisely regular that it wore, for a few weeks, a nickname no one says in papers anymore: Little Green Men. Then we learned that a corpse of a star spinning in a magnetic frenzy can click like a metronome for eons. The "wow" signal was so gorgeously on brand, a strong, narrow tone near hydrogen, that a human being actually wrote "wow" on the printout, then spent the next 4 decades being asked about it at every conference. It never repeated. Nature isn't trolling us. It's just richer than our metaphors. So where does that leave the spicy version of the question, the one that got you to press play? Could we, in any plausible sense, have tugged on the chain that led to an interstellar traveler aimed neatly through our living room? The grown-up answer is that we may have lit the porch. We may also have finally cleaned our glasses. If the traveler is real and unnatural, our loudest shouts gave it a timeline to aim for. If it's real and natural, our new habit of watching everything with boring diligence gave us the privilege of not missing it. In both cases, the moral is oddly similar. Mind your signals. Mind your methods. The universe hears one. Your colleagues judge the other. There's a line people like to attribute to Carl Sagan, a line scientists treat like a seatbelt rather than a silencer. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It sounds like a scold. It's actually an invitation. Bring the evidence. Make it boring in the best way. Make it repeat. Make it survive a lab you've never met and a critic you don't like. If a visitor is truly tapping on our cosmic window, the knock won't fade when we turn up the lights. For now, the smart money sits in a humble place. We test the orbit. We test the light curve. We test the radio dial that already sits, by happy tradition, near hydrogen's whisper. We keep our calendars honest by writing our expectations down where everyone can see them. And we allow ourselves, between tests, a small smile at the timing that doesn't quite let go of us. Maybe the universe didn't send a reply because we spoke. Maybe we simply became, at last, the kind of audience that notices when the curtain moves. Either way, the next scene is worth staying awake for. The first thing you notice about a genuine sky oddity is how rude it is about your schedule. It shows up at 3 in the morning, whispers on a frequency you promised your partner you wouldn't obsess over, and then has the audacity to drift out of range just as your coffee achieves sentience. The second thing you notice is that it refuses to be only one thing. A dot with coordinates is comforting. A dot that also hums is a conversation starter you didn't plan for. That hum, if it exists, doesn't arrive as music. It's closer to the tone your ears imagine after a long flight, except this one slides exactly the way physics says it must. As the object approaches, the tone creeps higher. As it recedes, it sighs lower. That slide is the Doppler shift, the same trick that makes a siren change pitch as an ambulance passes. In radio, it's the giveaway that a transmitter is moving with the thing you're watching, and not with, say, your neighbor's microwave. It's unromantic, but in this business, unromantic is how you sleep at night. The choreography that follows feels almost theatrical. One observatory hears something. They don't announce it. They call two friends who don't like them enough to lie. The dishes swing. The tone appears only when they point at the traveler, vanishes when they look a few degrees away, and returns when they swing back. The frequency sits in that quiet neighborhood astronomers have nicknamed the water hole, the band near the natural radio lines of hydrogen and the hydroxyl radical. We like that spot because the galaxy is relatively calm there. If you wanted to be heard, that's where you'd clear your throat. And no, it isn't illegal for nature to talk there, but it is unusual for it to speak in a needle-thin whisper that lives and dies with the motion of a single point of light. Even then, suspicion is healthy. You look for local culprits. Cell towers leak. Satellites mutter. Airplanes scatter ground signals off their metal bellies and make mischief, so you play a mean game of elimination. If a passing aircraft is the prankster, nearby frequencies will jiggle in sympathy. If a satellite is the source, the tone won't follow the object's exact Doppler choreography. If it's your own equipment, the tone will refuse to leave when you ask it to. Equipment has a toddler's attachment style. The good signals don't cling. They behave like the object behaves, not like your building's wiring. While the radio folks are arguing with their ghosts, the optical crowd is doing what they do best, turning brightness into biography. Watch a spinning shape in sunlight, and its glint rises and falls as different faces turn toward you. That brightness record is called a light curve, and it's the world's cheapest 3D scanner. Potatoes, our affectionate term for most small asteroids, make lumpy, irregular light curves. Thin panels turning like lazy windmills ride a different rhythm. If the traveler is a sheet, the curve breathes with slow, flat-top changes that feel like a book opening and closing. If it's a shard tumbling, the rhythm is chaotic, like a coin that can't decide which way to fall. No single night tells the whole story, but night after night, the sketch fills in. Closer in, radar tries to paint the thing with radio light and listen for the echo. Planetary radar is a little like photographing a black cat in a dark room by popping a flash and timing the bounce. You measure distance by how long the echo takes to come home, and you measure spin by the way the echo smears in frequency. The truly weird echoes don't smear the way gravel does. They act like mirrors, bright and sharp spikes when the orientation happens to be just so, and nearly mute when it's face on. Mirrors aren't proof of intention. Ice can behave that way. So can smooth metal. The trick is to see whether the mirror seems to aim itself. Further out in the spectrum, infrared watches warmth. Everything that soaks up sunlight has to get rid of the heat somehow, and the way it cools telegraphs its surface and thickness. A charcoal black rock warms and cools lazily. A thin film bleeds heat differently, sometimes holding steady across illumination changes as if it's managing its own thermostat. Engineers call those tricks thermal control. Nature calls them lucky geometry. The argument is half the fun. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the object glides past its perihelion, the moment of closest approach to the sun, and everyone leans forward because that's when comets betray themselves. A proper comet will throw off gas and dust as ices sublimate, building a fuzzy coma, and if we're lucky, a tail that gives away composition through spectral fingerprints. Spectra are just rainbows with footnotes. Water shouts in one part, carbon monoxide in another, and certain organic compounds paint the rainbow with specific notches. If the traveler stays clean when a comet ought to get messy, that's interesting. If it coughs a little, but the cough doesn't line up with heating, that's interesting in a different key. Meanwhile, the tone at the water hole keeps behaving itself. And this is where the grown-ups get out the measuring tape. A pure carrier and unmodulated tone is a doorbell. It tells you something is here. Add a pattern short and long, on and off, a rhythm that can't be confused with static, and it becomes language's shy preface. The most universal small talk is math. Prime numbers are the parade we can all clap along to. If a sequence appears, you check whether it's your own system hiccuping. You swap receivers, swap clocks, swap entire observatories. It's like changing the batteries in 5 flashlights before you accuse the moon of flickering. That's the technical part. The human part is Messier. Word leaks. It always does. Amateur radio operators are very good, very fast, and very allergic to the phrase, "trust us." They aim their software-defined radios at the same frequencies, record what they hear, and post spectrograms online. Now you're no longer conducting an experiment in a lab. You're performing one on a stage. The best thing you can do is embrace the crowd. Publish your pointing, your local weather, your equipment settings. Let traffic cones spring up around the slippery places. When hundreds of unrelated antennas across continents hear the same drift for the same minutes only when the traveler sits in their sky, the conspiracy theories get bored and wander off to find easier prey. Inevitably, someone says the line you expect them to say, "We've been fooled before." Pulsars masqueraded as beacons for a heartbeat of history. The wow signal never called back. Mysterious peritons turned out to be microwaves misused at lunch. If you work in this field long enough, humility is muscle memory. It's also a survival skill. You learn to celebrate the test as much as the find. There's a peculiar joy in watching a beautiful candidate evaporate under better data. It means your tools work. It means the next beautiful thing, if it survives, will be real. None of that dampens the thrill when two independent threads braid together. A light curve that looks like a sheet and a radio tone that behaves like a disciplined metronome are each interesting alone. Together, they force better questions. If radiation pressure, the push of sunlight, can noticeably steer a thin, very light object, the brightness pattern ought to wobble in a particular way when the sun angle changes. If someone is deliberately managing that angle, the wobble might be too tidy for a purely natural sail. On the radio side, if the tone is being generated aboard, Its stability, the way it holds a frequency, may shame our best crystal oscillators. Stars don't carry atomic clocks. Engineers do. The last move, before anyone lets the word message out of their mouth, is painfully simple. You ask it to do something on cue. You don't beam Shakespeare. You just flash a porch light at the cosmic equivalent of a doorbell and see whether the ding changes to a dong at your chosen moment. In radio, that looks like gently toggling your transmitter on a frequency near the tone and seeing if the tone twitches in sympathy a predictable number of minutes later. Accounting for the time light needs to make the round trip. In optics, it looks like pulsing a laser at safe power and watching for a tiny, synchronized blink in brightness that can't be blamed on scintillating air or fussy instruments. If nothing happens, you learn that nothing happens. If something happens once, you assume you got lucky. If it happens twice with the right timing, you buy more coffee. If it happens 3 times and your fiercest critic can't break it with a wrench, you call it what it is: interaction. There's a lovely irony in all this. The more extraordinary the idea, the more boring the proof has to be. Boring in the sense that anyone, anywhere, with the right tools, can repeat it until they're yawning. Boring in the sense that your enemy would have to sabotage physics itself to prevent the result from reappearing. Boring enough that it outlasts the news cycle and the memes and the way we flit from marvel to marvel like sparrows in a parking lot. So no, we don't go yet in the way grandparents used the word no, whether a traveler listened to our century of chatter and sent a polite reply on a narrow beam through the solar glare. What we do know is that the dot refuses to be only a dot, that the hum refuses to be only a hum, and that the tests designed to make dreams die are, for once, not doing their usual tidy job. That doesn't prove romance. It proves persistence. It proves we're finally treating wonder with the same care we lavish on worry. If this is a doorbell, it will keep ringing when we step closer, not only when we lean away. If it's a wind chime, it will keep tinkling whenever the solar breeze kicks, not when we clap. Either way, we'll find out by doing the unglamorous things well and resisting the urge to narrate the ending before the middle has had its say. The night we decided to say hello on purpose, the air at the observatory felt like an exam room before the proctor coughs. No speeches, no ceremony, just a calm voice on intercom counting down to a pulse of radio light nudged a hair below the hydrogen line. The quiet frequency astronomers treat like the library of the sky. We didn't send poetry. We sent the radio equivalent of a polite throat clear, held for a few heartbeats, then silence long enough for light to run the out and back between us and the traveler. That delay is called the round-trip light time. Space keeps the receipt. What you want after a ping like that isn't fireworks. You want something dull and obedient. If a tone lives on the traveler, it should twitch exactly when our nudge arrives. Not a second sooner, not a second late, and it should twitch the same way every time we poke it. Phase the alignment of the wave's peaks and valleys is a wonderful tattletale. Change the phase by a pinch, and the tone steps sideways in a way even a sleepy graduate student can see on a spectrogram. We poked, we waited, the tone winced. Then it went back to being a metronome. Once could be luck, twice could be mercy. 3 times, spaced by the same round-trip light time, with independent dishes on different continents seeing the same dance, starts to smell like a handshake. Skepticism didn't take the night off. Solar wind can rattle plasma around an object. Instrument chains burp. Ground transmitters reflect off planes at obscene angles. So we played the same game we always play when something interesting happens. Change everything except the sky. New receiver. New dish. New clock. Point away, the twitch vanishes. Point back, there it is, precisely where the math says it ought to be. Shaped the same, timed the same, indifferent to our hopes, and very attentive to physics. A senior radio astronomer summed it up on the chat channel with a line that belongs on a mug. Extraordinary ideas need boring proofs. For once, the boring parts kept lining up. Radio got company. An optical telescope downrange pulsed a low-power laser, not a sci-fi beam. Just a carefully timed series of harmless glints and cameras watched the traveler's brightness for anything that moved in step. Space is a noisy stage for twinkles. Air wobbles, detectors sulk. But on the third run, a shy blink appeared at the predicted instant. A tiny uptick in reflected light that matched our pulse pattern like a whispered echo in an empty room. Nobody framed it. Nobody printed t-shirts. We filed it under consistent with interaction, which is scientist for don't jinx it. The radio tone stopped being only a doorbell. It began to carry a rhythm short, long like a drummer who knows you're listening. The rhythm wasn't random. It marched through prime numbers again, but this time with a telltale flourish. Palindromic spacing, the same rhythm forward and backward. Nature loves symmetry, but when symmetry shows up exactly when you ask for it, in a band of sky you've just tapped, you perk up. The modulation stayed gentle, almost shy, as if the transmitter were tossing pebbles into a pond while making sure not to swamp our little boats. Patterns grow like ivy. First a leaf, then two, and a trellis appears where you didn't know one was built. The tone began to open with a fixed preface, a recognizable header, like the beep beep you hear before an old telemetry stream, followed by a strip of precise timing marks. Those marks gave us a clock. Having a shared clock in a conversation is everything. It lets you say, we'll put the important stuff at these moments, and know your partner will look at those moments with a fresh cup of attention. After the timing track came something that looked suspiciously like a compass. 3 orthogonal chunks of data that behaved like coordinates. When we nudged the transmitter and watched how the chunks wobbled, build a clock, build a frame of reference, then maybe dare to say something. What came next wasn't a greeting card. It felt more like a lab manual written by someone polite. A set of numbers drifted by that matched the general shape of the traveler's path through our solar system. Not in our symbols, of course, but in ratios and repeats any orbital mechanic would recognize. Orbital elements are like a planet's travel ID. How stretched the path is, how tilted, how close it comes to the sun, where it sits along the route right now. We saw those ideas peeking through in the data, tied to the shared clock, tied to the frame. If you wanted to prove you understand your own motion in someone else's house, that's how you do it. Not with a flourish, but with a quiet map. The moral philosophers will have their decade, but in the control room, the ethics lived in the settings pane. Don't blast. Don't hog the band. Don't forget there are whales and birds that use the sky as an instrument. We kept our transmissions modest, our schedules sparse, and our documentation public. The good faith mattered as much as the good physics. Open logs meant anyone with a backyard dish or a borrowed receiver could watch the same twitch, the same palindromic rhythm, the same little bow of light that appeared to nod when we knocked. If you're going to claim a conversation, invite people to the porch. Or it's a plasma thing, someone would say every 20 minutes. On principle, fine. Then you ask it to do a very unplasma-like trick. You ask for a deliberate skip, a pause that's longer by one prime number than the last round. And you ask for it 3 times in a row at intervals. Only your shared clock and your round-trip delay can explain. Plasma doesn't read room cues. Whatever lives on that traveler did, or at least performed the role with alarming composure. The skips appeared in the right places, not too early, not too late. Like a metronome tapping the table with you, not with the wind. It would be lovely to tell you the next act was a revelation in neon. It wasn't. It was patient and slightly funny, like being taught a game by a teacher who knows you're bright but easily distracted. We were given a yardstick, a unit, defined in terms of hydrogen's little flip, the fundamental radio transition that sets the tone of the cosmos. We were handed a triangle and a square, then the ratio that haunts every circle, whether it likes it or not. The message stayed numbingly simple, and that simplicity was the tell. When you meet someone on a bridge built out of timing marks and shared frequencies, you don't start with Shakespeare. You start with the nouns. The object itself behaved like a student drawing letters in the air. When the radio hinted circle, the brightness curve slipped into a smooth, single-peak rhythm we hadn't seen before, and it held there just long enough to be noticed, just short enough to make us doubt our senses, then went back to its previous, lazier spin. When the radio hinted square, the light pattern became boxier, as if broad faces took turns flashing. Could thermal effects mimic that? Maybe. Could a cometary jet impersonate geometry on cue? Only if comets had been taking evening classes. Not every session landed. A gust of solar wind would smear the tone. Clouds would bully an optical test. Sometimes the traveler ignored us, or looked like it did. That's part of the lesson too. The sky owes no one a clean data run, and whoever is choreographing on the other end may have their own tides and limits. The point isn't perfection. The point is trend. Over weeks, the number of "that's odd" that survived fresh batteries and grumpy reviewers kept inching up, until even the pessimists were using their serious voices. A question floated around the room after one of the better nights. Half a joke and half a prayer. If this is how they say, "We are here," how will they say, "This is safe"? The answer, such as it was, seemed to be baked into the humility of the exchange. No high-power blasts, no sudden frequency sweeps, no attempts to own the band or drown out the sky's own songs. Whoever wrote this play knew radiobiology and etiquette. They matched our loudness. They left us room to think. They made it possible for a dozen small dishes, far from any capital, to participate without feeling like bystanders at a parade. So yes, we're still allergic to the word message. It makes the eyebrows of the careful folks twitch. But call it what you like, the pattern has stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like a partner, present when summoned courteously, quiet when asked, patient with our clumsy timing, gently insistent that we build a common clock, a common compass, and a common set of shapes before we try anything fancy. If that's not how you would greet a newborn technological species, how would you? There's a moment after the first successful exchange when the room gets noisier and quieter at the same time. People talk, sure, but under it there's this hush that says, okay, now we have to ask the awkward question. Not what did it say, but why us, why now? That's the part that makes even the cheeriest astronomer lean back in the chair and stare at the ceiling tiles as if the pattern might confess something. The cheap answer is that we didn't summon anything. Space is full of junk. Sometimes the junk tumbles through. That's tidy, and it lets you finish your coffee in peace. But a couple of things kept tugging at that tidy sleeve. First, the timing. Not minutes or days, decades. If you rewind the tape of Earth's radio life, you can actually watch our bubble of noise swell outward like a soap sphere. At first, it's weak and sloppy. Baseball broadcast here, a crooner there. Nothing an alien audiophile would brag about hearing. But then we get ambitious. We build radars that can light up Venus and bounce off asteroids like we're tapping on the tank of the solar system. Those beams are bright. They sweep the sky. And they leave Earth carrying our return address, whether we meant it or not. One of the seniors in the group, unflappable, cardiganed, could tame a room with a raised eyebrow like to say, we didn't ring a doorbell. We tripped a motion sensor we installed ourselves. The motion sensor in this case being a century of electromagnetic bragging, capped by a few very loud shouts. If anyone within a few dozen light years was paying only half attention, the day we started lancing planets with megawatt radar was the day there's something weird in the neighborhood. Alarm lit up. Of course, you can connect any 2 points if you're generous with your pencil. That's the trap. So people who do this for a living tried not to draw a face on the clouds. They did the annoying but necessary thing. They lined up the loudest parts of our broadcast history alongside the possible departure times for a fast interstellar traveler and asked, in their driest voices, does this make sense without a cape and theme music? The answer came back as a shrug with raised eyebrows. It might. Not a slam dunk, never that, but weird in a way that refused to go back in the box once you'd seen it. It got stranger. While we were still patting ourselves on the back for nudging a tone and getting a nudge back, the all-sky surveys started clearing their throats. Another fast mover, and then another, each one on a path that didn't bind to the sun like the respectable local rocks do. You could hear keyboards go a little feral. We don't see a bus for years, and then suddenly 3 pull up behind each other? The first rule of astronomy is don't get cute, but the second is notice when the universe insists on a theme. It's one thing for a single interstellar visitor to fall through our yard. It's another to watch a small parade arrive along similar lanes, as if someone set up a corridor and told the couriers aim for this zip code. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying that's what it felt like when you looked at the sky map with your surely not voice on, and the sky map just stared back, unblinking. The argument that heated up after midnight was deliciously nerdy. On one side, the romantics with spreadsheets. If you assume they first noticed us when the strongest of our stuff washed over their neighborhood, and if you assume they can cruise at a healthy fraction of light speed without sweating, the math says this arrival window isn't crazy. On the other side, the Puritans with red pens. Yes, but you've picked your favorite stars after the fact. If you let yourself scan the whole sky and all history, you will always find an alignment that flatters your hunch. What statisticians call the look elsewhere gremlin. In the middle sat a few exhausted souls who had started the week rolling their eyes at anything with the word trigger in it and were now admitting, through clenched teeth, that the coincidence stack was starting to look like more than a stack. I don't love this, one of them said, but I don't hate it either. That's as close to a love letter as you get in a building where the coffee is strong and the adjectives are weak. Here's a saner story than summoning, and it's oddly more flattering to us. Imagine you're an old, patient civilization that keeps half an ear on the neighborhood. You're not prowling for friends every day. You just have a net out. One day, a new kind of chirp hits the net. Not a natural thing, not a volcanic hiss or a pulsar tick, but a voice with structure. You don't send your mothership. You send something modest, a postcard that can steer, a few cousins to act as backups, and you aim them at a geometry where the locals are most likely to notice without panicking. It's not a reply to a single message. It's acknowledgement of a phase change. The pond grew loud enough to be interesting. You throw a pebble back. That sits better than we summoned aliens with a sitcom. It also matches the vibe of the thing we've been seeing on the scope. Low drama, careful choreography, and almost parental awareness of our limits. If you want to believe in galactic etiquette, this is how it behaves. No floodlights, no speeches, just a crisp rhythm and a willingness to teach the alphabet before moving on to nouns. Around this time, the telescopes that see in heat rather than light started to whisper their own riddles. The traveler wasn't warming and cooling like a chunk of ice should. Parts of it seemed to hold temperature steady, as if they had shutters. That doesn't prove anything other than this is interesting, but it certainly tied a bow around the notion that someone designed something to behave on purpose in sunlight rather than merely endure it. As one engineer put it with a grin, nature can be baroque, but it usually isn't adjustable on demand. If you're wondering where the grown-ups were while we swapped theories at 3 in the morning and were signing very careful pieces of paper, when the first intercontinental conversation looks plausible, lawyers wake up early. Who gets to talk? On whose authority? What frequency is polite? What power is safe? There's a reason the hydrogen line is called the waterhole in radio. Folklore. It's the quiet patch where everyone can sip and see one another. You don't blast air horns there. You bring a thermos and a soft voice. The plan we ended up with was so boring it felt noble. Coordinated time slots, gentle power, all logs public, all gear double-checked by people with no skin in the glory game. There was one beautifully petty moment in this otherwise lofty chapter. Someone suggested we hide a tiny watermark in our reply, a sleight of hand in the timing that would let us prove later, beyond argument, that we had been first to do this particular trick. A junior tech, bless them, raised a hand and said, if they can cross interstellar space, they can find our watermark. Maybe let's not start with a magic show. The watermark went in the bin. Sometimes a species does the grown-up thing by accident. So, did we trigger it? If by trigger you mean push a red button and something popped out of hyperspace, no. If by trigger you mean shift the odds from maybe to likely by making ourselves obvious for a century, then it's hard to escape the feeling that we've finally spoken away. The neighborhood's patient listeners could not politely ignore. One astrophysicist, who usually refuses metaphors, allowed a small one on a late Zoom. We weren't whispering in the dark and getting an answer. We were singing in the stairwell for years. Someone cracked the door and hummed the next bar. That hum is still modest. It hasn't turned into a symphony or a sermon. It has turned into instructions sturdy enough to pass between species that don't share an alphabet. It has turned into a map of where to point future ears. It has turned into a reminder that polite doesn't mean timid and cautious doesn't mean dull. The universe might be full of minds that prefer this style of hello. Careful, redundant, reversible, generous with clocks, and stingy with drama. There will be other nights like the first. Some will flop. Some will sing. The look elsewhere folks will keep us honest, and may the sky bless them for it. The romantics will keep asking the questions that make the rest of us drink water and go for a walk. Between them lies the thin path we've been walking since we learned to poke the cosmos and listen for the echo. We are not the main character of the galaxy. We might, however, be a new voice that just learned how to stay on pitch. The strangest thing about a world hearing back from the dark is how ordinary the calendar keeps pretending to be. Garbage trucks still clatter past dawn windows. The dog still needs to go out. But just under the routine, there's this pull, like a tide, and it's dragging thoughts toward the sky, whether you're ready or not. Therapists joked gently that they'd need bigger waiting rooms. People described a new kind of buzzing in the head. Not panic exactly, more like the feeling you get before a big trip, when the suitcase is open and you're suddenly aware that socks exist. One clinician gave it a name that stuck because it sounded clinical and kind at once. Contact syndrome. Not an illness, a phase. Dreams got louder, sleep got thinner. Office conversations took the scenic route through cosmic small talk before wandering back to budgets and lunch. Belief found itself in a different light too, and it turned out light could be kinder than everyone feared. A bishop who had quietly studied astronomy for decades stepped to a pulpit and said, "Creation is larger." That's not a threat to faith. That's a reason to breathe deeper. A rabbi compared the new voices to discovering distant branches of an old family tree and advised curiosity over comet wars. An imam pointed to verses about worlds and signs and suggested we had simply added one more sign to the ledger. A Zen teacher, smiling like a person who has been practicing for this exact moment, said, "Mind is wide." You could still find the end of days flyers stapled to lampposts, because the end of days people have an excellent staple budget, but they were the sideshow, not the center. Commerce did what commerce does. Markets flinched, then sprinted, and pretended they'd meant to do that all along. Satellite companies reassured shareholders that a whisper on the hydrogen line, the quiet radio frequency associated with neutral hydrogen atoms and used by astronomers as a sort of cosmic meeting place, would not scramble your favorite streaming service. Semiconductor folks fielded calls about oscillators, those little heartbeat circuits that keep timing precise, as if every basement was about to sprout a telescope array. A startup tried to sell first contact insurance and was promptly roasted, which, to be fair, they had to expect. Somewhere in there, a coffee brand relabeled a dark roast Event Horizon and moved a lot of beans. The art students were ready before anyone. Within days, galleries filled with slow, humming installations that pulsed prime numbers in light and shadow. The simplest mathematical signal you can send to say, yes, there's a mind here. Poets snuck spectrograms, those rainbow fingerprints of sound, into their visual work, because nothing says new sonnets like a radio whisper turned into color. A jazz quartet put on a midnight set where the drummer kept time with the Doppler shift of the signal. The tiny slide in frequency that proves it's out there moving. People who hadn't been out late in years found themselves standing on sidewalks at 1 in the morning, listening to music that seemed to know something about the cold between the stars and not mine. Schools pivoted with a clunk and then surprisingly graceful steps. A chemistry teacher rolled a radio cart into class like it was 1998 again and said, "Today we are eavesdropping on hydrogen." A fifth grader built a cardboard model of a radio dish and taped the words, "Be nice," to the rim for reasons that defeated explanation and also explained everything. University intro courses in statistics filled faster than concert tickets because skepticism suddenly felt like a civic duty, not a vibe. One professor started her first lecture with a line that should be printed on billboards. Wonder without discipline is gullibility. Discipline without wonder is a nap. Families invented little rituals. Some went onto rooftops with thermoses and a cousin's binoculars to check on the neighbors, which meant pointing at nothing in particular and grinning at the sky anyway. Neighborhoods hosted quiet nights where outdoor lights stayed dim, and someone with a telescope let everyone take a turn. There is no experience quite like hearing a child gasp at a blurry smudge that happens to be a galaxy, and then realizing the child has just updated their definition of neighborhood to include 100 billion stars. Regulators, for their part, discovered they could be both careful and human. The people who normally assigned frequencies like librarians assigning reading chairs issued a statement that was half legalese, half lullaby. Yes, the hydrogen line remains protected for astronomy. No, you cannot launch your own Hello Cannon. Please stop emailing about the Hello Cannon. Underneath the humor, the plan was simple. We would talk politely, slowly, and together. A scientist who had been around long enough to watch 3 generations of telescopes arrive and leave said, "First contact doesn't have to mean first chaos," and then put on a hard hat because construction was noisy next door, and you can't pause the real world while you adjust the story about it. Not everything was noble. A handful of accounts pumped out fakes so polished they fooled experts for a few minutes at a time. One clip claimed to show the object blinking a pattern visible to the naked eye over Omaha. It did not. Omaha, unfairly, took the blame. After a week of that nonsense, a group of radio folks launched a public dashboard that showed the actual signal in real time. As raw and dull and gorgeous as truth can be, the hoaxes withered in that sunlight. A reporter asked if the dashboard team considered themselves heroes. "Not really," the lead said. "We just preferred graphs to chaos. If you want a single image for how strange the normal became, try the scene at a certain observatory, where a line of people formed at midnight to quietly stand under a dish the size of a football field. No fireworks, no countdown. Just a human urge to be near the ear that was listening, as if you might overhear the cosmos by proximity." A teenager took a selfie with the concrete support pillar and captioned it, "Me in the ear." It was silly and perfect. The most honest mood belonged to the people who had hoped for this all their lives and were also terrified of getting what they asked for. An astronomer who once published a paper debunking a too good to be true claim, a professional breaker of hearts, said in a live stream, "If this turns out to be natural, we will have learned something profound about the way nature sings. If it isn't natural, we will have learned we have company. Either way, it's a good day to be the kind of animal that can be surprised." She paused, laughed at herself, and added, "And a better day to be the kind of animal that can admit it." There were practical ripples you could feel underfoot. City councils dusted off dark sky ordinances and argued about whether anyone truly needs a billboard that can be seen from orbit. Farmers remembered the old trick of watching for birds, confused by bright night lighting, and made small changes that helped both birds and stars. Tech companies quietly built more tools for timekeeping, because when you're trying to line up a message with something moving that fast, your clocks have to agree down to a whisper. And then there was the kitchen table diplomacy. People asked one another what we should say next, and for once, the internet felt like a town square that wasn't trying to sell you something. The consensus tilted toward humility, so gently you might not have noticed it happening. Not a speech, not a poem, not a manifesto, just another short sequence proving we understand what they sent, and we can add one small layer of our own. If the first exchange established nouns and verbs, the second would be a sentence. The point wasn't to impress. The point was to keep the conversation fragile and alive. An elder in one community meeting put it in a way that made the room go quiet. "When you meet a neighbor," she said, "you don't bring your whole house, you bring bread." That was the tone that won the night. Practical, warm, aware that the cosmos is big enough to make us small without making us less. And somewhere, woven through the legal memos and the radio schedules and the market hiccups and the songs and strange time signatures, you could feel the species stretching, not into panic, but into proportion. If the story paused here, with humans looking up and not flinching, it would already be a decent ending. But the story did what stories do when curiosity pays rent on courage. It kept going. Plans that used to take a decade grew legs. Spreadsheets became hardware. Someone taped a paper sign on a lab door that read, as if muttering to fate, "No drama, just rendezvous." It was a joke, but you could taste the plan under it. We were going to try to catch the thing that had waved at us. Here's how it began to feel real. A whiteboard that used to be covered in long-term roadmaps suddenly had a messy rectangle in the middle labeled September window, and around it, arrows like a flock of birds. The vibe was less grand crusade, more we can make this Tuesday if nobody sneezes. The plan was ridiculous, and also apparently happening. Launch something fast, steer it cleaner than a surgeon's hand, and meet a visitor that does not care about our Gantt charts. The people tasked with this wore the same expression bakers get at 4 a.m., its focus mixed with a quiet dare to the universe. One flight director summed up the mood without looking up from his coffee. "We're not inventing magic," he said. "We're stacking the magic we already have." Translation for the rest of us. Instead of dreaming up brand new engines, they raided the pantry. Big booster already flying. Solar electric thrusters already proven. Guidance software already cranky and reliable. The trick was choreography, not alchemy. If you haven't met a solar electric engine, imagine a patient hummingbird that never stops. It uses electricity from solar panels to fling charged gas out the back, very gently, for months. The push is tiny each second, but over time, it adds up to serious speed. That cumulative push has a fancy Greekish name, delta V. The change in velocity you need to pull off bold moves, but in practice, it's the difference between watching the guest zip by and actually making the handshake. The target was not going to make that handshake easy. Picture a thin, dark thing, fast as a bad rumor, crossing the inner solar system on a path that refuses to bend just because our feelings are involved. It had already shown it could tweak its attitude, the way a lazy weather vane will snap to a new wind. Except this wind was sunlight, and the vane looked suspiciously like a design choice. Meeting something like that is less like parking beside a curb and more like tossing a note into a convertible, doing highway speeds and hoping the driver reads it. So the mission design did what all good plans do. It cheated gracefully. A launch when Earth's spin gave the rocket a little extra fling. A trajectory that leaned on the sun's gravity, the way a skateboarder leans into a curve. If a Venus swing by was available gravity assist, being the polite term for borrowing speed from a planet, without a payback schedule that was sketched in pencil, ready to erase if the calendar tightened. Every kilometer per second counted. Every minute shaved from the schedule felt like a small miracle purchased with spreadsheet tears. And then there was the aim. To hit a moving target in space, you don't aim where it is. You aim where it will be and then argue with physics until it agrees. That means your clock has to be right in a way regular clocks are not. The team synchronized time the way orchestras tune, except the conductor was a set of atomic clocks. Those finicky boxes that count the wiggle of atoms and keep time better than our best poets. Star trackers, the camera systems that recognize constellations. Like faces, we're trained to treat the sky as a map and the visitor as a single pixel with an attitude problem. The spacecraft would learn the rhythm of that pixel's drift, correct itself in whispers, and keep correcting. Because this was not a flyby for postcards. They wanted to talk, so they packed a voice. Radio first, because that's the lingua franca of empty space. A transmitter that could sing narrow and strong, with simple math embedded in the pauses like beads on a string. And as a backup, light. Laser communication is just radio that went to finishing school. Tighter beams, higher data rates, fussier alignment. If the visitor could see the wink of a well-timed laser and wink back, the whole world would be able to mouth the same amazed word. Oh, somewhere between romantic and bureaucratic sat the argument about touching. Do you reach out with a little probe to taste a breath of material if the thing sheds any near perihelion? That close swing by the sun where ices fume and metals complain? Or do you keep hands strictly to yourself and settle for the seeing and the listening? Planetary protection folks, whose job is to imagine every way curiosity can turn into contamination and then say no with love, proposed a rule so reasonable it felt radical. Observe first, sample only if nature volunteers, never scratch the paint. An ethicist watching from the back of the room murmured, "First impressions matter," and suddenly everyone saw the diplomatic angle in the lab coats. Publicly, agencies talked about international cooperation. Privately, they discovered they meant it. The deep space dishes in 3 continents took turns like runners in a relay. A European propulsion unit with years of flight heritage found itself bolted to an American bus the color of unripe fruit. Navigators in India and Japan traded Doppler plots, those tiny frequency shifts that reveal speed, with colleagues in Chile, who were steering telescopes to refine the target's path. A young engineer in Canberra wrote code at 2 a.m. That let 2 ground stations negotiate handovers with fewer dropped syllables. The PR teams never said it outright, but the subtext was clear. If this encounter worked, the credit would be multilingual. Risk never left the room. It just learned to sit quietly. Space is the most brilliant saboteur in the business. Dust can pockmark optics. A solar flare can slap electronics hard enough to make them forget their names. A forgotten safety interlock can stay forgotten until the story you tell your grandchildren begins with "We almost had it." The mission leads built a second set of everything they could afford to duplicate and taught the spacecraft how to pick the best option without waiting for Earth to weigh in. That last part mattered. Even at interplanetary distances, light takes minutes to carry our "please do this" and minutes more to bring back a "did that." In a dance that fast, the partner on the spot has to hear the music. And the music was a lot of math in disguise. The plan called for arriving not beside, but slightly below and behind the visitor, sliding into a lane where sunlight would bounce through the thin structure like a whisper through a shell. If there was a specular flash of mirror-bright glint that timed itself to our transmissions, that would be the hello everyone craved. If there wasn't, that would be a hello of a different kind, the kind that says, "Keep trying, you're close." If you picture mission control his rows of grim jaws and furrowed brows. You need an update. There were jokes, the gallows kind, and the kindergarten kind. Someone printed a poster that read, "We break for hyperbolic guests," taped slightly crooked. Someone else put a bowl of green and blue candies under a sign that said, "Astrofuel." In a corner, a veteran guidance engineer taught a new hire how to read a plot that looks like a stack of spaghetti, but is, in fact, a map of the next 6 hours. "See that?" he said, tapping a line that wiggled less than the others. "That's the universe agreeing to our terms." Under the mischief lived a stubborn kind of humility. They knew this could be nothing more than a glorious whiff, a brush past a mystery with cameras clicking and no reply. They knew it could also be the opposite of lonely, a whisper back, a modulation shift, a small, crisp pattern that says, "With the self-control of a very old mind, we see you seeing us." One of the younger analysts taped a single sentence to her monitor. "Even a no is data." It read like comfort and courage at once. And then there was the rest of us, watching countdown clocks that were really count-up clocks, because everything important happens after 0. Kids learned the word rendezvous and used it on the dog. Neighborhoods scheduled late-night picnics, because if the future is going to show up, snacks should too. The signal dashboards crawled with more visitors than any science site has a right to expect. Someone pointed a small backyard radio at the hydrogen line and listened to nothing with intent, which is pretty much the definition of faith, minus the candles. When the day came, it didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like the air in a theater 1 second before the lights go down. Dishes tilted, panels woke. A dot met a dot in a coordinate system, so large you could slip 1,000 Earths between the lines. And in a control room full of people who have learned to mistrust adjectives, a voice still broke decorum by whispering one. "Beautiful. If you were hoping for drama, I'm sorry and also not sorry." Real exploration is mostly competence with tiny, exquisite surprises. A change in carrier tone that lands exactly where a model predicted is one such surprise. So is a glint that repeats on schedule, not bright enough to make the news anchors gasp, just bright enough to make the math breathe. Somewhere in that hush, the hunch hardened. We hadn't summoned anything by being loud. We'd simply been noticeable long enough for someone meticulous to decide we were worth a look. The first surprise was how ordinary the extraordinary looked when it hit the screens. No neon triangles, no sci-fi hieroglyphs, just numbers sliding in time, a whisper of energy parked next to a very famous frequency called the hydrogen line. If that phrase sounds like a jazz club, here's the quick version. Hydrogen, the simplest atom, emits radio waves at about 1420 megahertz when its electron flips orientation. Astronomers love that spot because the universe itself points to it. If you wanted to say, "We're here," to anyone with a radio, you'd hang your note near hydrogen's porch light. The second surprise was how fast the grown-ups put the excitement in a seatbelt. "Every wow needs a how," said Dr. Elena Martinez, who has the kind of calm that makes coffee behave. Her team didn't just look. They pre-committed to how they would look. That's called pre-registration promising, before you peek at the data, exactly which patterns will count as interesting. So you can't convince yourself after the fact that the cloud you're staring at is a perfect horse. They ran twin pipelines at different universities, used different code, and compared notes like Cold War codebreakers. Somewhere in the mix, a senior engineer slipped in a blind injection, once a fake signal nobody else knew about, just to see whether the tools would pounce on fool's gold. They did, which is precisely what you want from tools, and a healthy reason to distrust your own goosebumps. Meanwhile, the thing itself kept doing its very polite, very stubborn routine. No dramatic fountains, no flamboyant tail. A little warmth under sunlight, a little rotation that behaved more like a sailor trimming a sail than a rock tumbling after a shove. When spectra came in the rainbow fingerprints, that tell you what something's made of. The colors didn't match any one cookbook. Plenty of carbon, yes, but arranged in ways that made the materials folks blink and lean closer. Natural? Possibly. Unusual? Absolutely. The radio story got stranger and simpler at once. Picture a metronome you can only hear when you point a dish the size of a building at a small moving coordinate in the sky. Now picture the tick-tock separating into two kinds of ticks, a steady carrier and tiny patterns tucked into it. Elementary school math arrived first, the kind a galaxy could agree on. Primes those stubborn numbers you can't neatly divide by anything but themselves. And one stepped out, like a drum line. 2, then 3, then 5, then 7. Nobody pretended a comet does that by accident. The argument, such as it was, lived one level up. Were we reading intention, or were we reading ourselves? Skeptics were not the villains of this movie. They were the reason the rest of us could sleep. Humans are Olympic-level pattern finders, said Dr. Robert Hayes, whose job in life is to ask if the rabbit in the noise is actually a bush. He reminded everyone that we once etched canals on Mars with our imaginations, and that a single unrepeatable wow in 1977 still haunts radio astronomy like a party trick no one could pull off twice. So the rule was repetition. If the beat comes back on multiple nights and multiple observatories with the right Doppler slide as the object moves, the Doppler bit is just the ambulance siren trick applied to radio. Approach makes the pitch a touch higher, departure a touch lower, then you're allowed to get excited in pencil. It kept coming back. The metronome wasn't just ticking, it was teaching. After the primes, there was a breath, then groups of pulses that matched the small integers the way children learn them. After that, something that looked a lot like a shorthand for the periodic table crept in atomic numbers for hydrogen, helium, lithium familiar ground drawn with unfamiliar penmanship. A graduate student in Japan noticed that a few entries didn't land where our human chart puts them. Not wrong, necessarily. More like, here's a nuance you haven't nailed. If a message can smirk, that one did. In the background, the old arguments about earlier visitors were dusted off and re-examined. The first interstellar oddball we ever saw, Oumuamua, had nudged itself in a way gravity alone couldn't explain. Comets do that by outgassing, which is a glamourless term for ices turning to vapor and kicking like tiny rocket thrusters. Then came 2I Borisov, a proper, textbook comet that reassured the textbooks. This new guest seemed to split the difference, thermally quiet when it shouldn't be, reflective where you don't expect mirrors, fussy about its orientation in a way rubble never is. That wasn't proof of anything, only a growing list of HM. The optical team found their own when they stacked hours of images and measured a whisper-thin glint that repeated on a schedule that matched the radio pulses. If you've ever used a mirror to throw sunlight around a room, you know the trick. This felt like the universe returning the favor, except the angle and timing lined up too well for coincidence. It's either the best-timed accident of all time, said Dr. Yuki Tanaka, or the most subtle wave. Then came a choice, the kind science tries not to dramatize. Do you answer deliberately where the visitor is already talking? Or do you wait months for every committee in 3 time zones to bless the punctuation? The answer split the difference. A modest, pre-agreed hello. Our own primes sent at the same hydrogen line neighborhood, with a correction for the Doppler slide so we weren't yelling off-key. Nothing culturally spicy, just math with good manners. 18 minutes is what light needs to go there and back at that distance. The longest half hour in a lot of careers felt like that times 2. When the reply arrived, it didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived as a slight change in the pattern, as if a metronome had tilted its head. The prime sequence returned, but the spacing carried a new layer, like syncopation in a drum beat. A few pulses later, the pattern we mapped to orbital motion appeared, a neat little model of a path curving through an ellipse that only makes sense if the sender understands gravity the way we do. Embedded in that were numbers that matched the visitor's current distance and speed better than our best. Predictions had managed the day before. Either we'd built a mirror, or someone was proving they could see themselves and us very clearly. That's when the philosophers and the procurement people showed up in the same sentence. Because buried gently, almost politely in the rhythm, was a sketch of a machine. Not a starship blueprint. A transmitter. Think of it as directions for building a lighthouse, tuned to the same universal porch light we started with. No exotic unobtainium, no magic. Just awkwardly elegant engineering that our best labs could actually attempt. Spread out the emitters. Synchronize them more precisely than we currently think is fun. Put the business end somewhere quiet. Maybe the moon's far side, where Earth's own chatter doesn't drown out shy guests. And crucially, don't blast your own biosphere while you're at it. The safety notes were conspicuous, like someone who'd made mistakes a long time ago and didn't want us repeating them. Not everyone cheered. There's a reasonable school of thought that says, stop telling the forest where you camp. Another that says we've been glowing on every band for a century and the forest already knows. A radio astronomer in West Virginia put it this way: we already left our porch light on. This is about deciding whether to put up a mailbox. The mailbox metaphor stuck because it turns the cosmic drama back into neighborhood chores where it belongs. While the grown-ups negotiated frameworks with names so long they need 3 acronyms, the data work stayed stubbornly unglamorous. Teams tried to break the case their colleagues were building. They swapped datasets and tore into each other's code looking for the gremlins that always hide between a decimal and a deadline. A young analyst found a sneaky bias in how one array handled interference and promptly killed a minor claim that would have made a great headline but a lousy legacy. She got a standing ovation in a Slack channel, and a day later, a grumpy email from a tabloid. Science has a sense of humor, but it also has receipts. Quietly, a consensus grew the way dawn does, by making everything else more visible. Natural processes can be weird. Statistics can be cruel. Humans can fool themselves. All of that remained true, but it was also true that the simplest story explaining all the independent, repeatable observations was no longer rock with attitude. It was someone set this up to be found by the kind of minds that notice primes in hydrogen and gravity, then waited to see if we'd notice back. If that sounds like romance, the engineers will happily kill the mood with power budgets and error bars, which is how it should be. Awe is for us at home. Precision is for the folks steering the beams. By the end of the week, the whiteboard rectangle labeled September window had a sibling labeled first handshake. The handwriting was the same, but the posture around it was different. Less breath holding, more knit-brow practicality. A mission like this is an opera built from scales. You practice until the notes stop being notes and start being music. Somewhere in the hum of hydrogen and primes, that's what it felt like. The first bar of a song we didn't know we knew. The argument that finally got everyone to stop pacing sounded like something your neighbor might say over a fence. We already left the porch light on. This is just deciding whether to put out a mailbox. The porch light was our century of radio leakage, from baseball games to planetary radar. The mailbox was what the visitor seemed to be nudging us toward, a purpose-built transmitter we controlled on purpose, not by accident. A beacon, not a laser pointer into the dark, but more like a lighthouse that blinks in a way anyone with a bit of math could recognize. There were, predictably, 2 equal and opposite moods. The first was the careful one, the voice that checks the door twice. We should understand the neighborhood before we give out our address, said Dr. Robert Hayes, not wrong and not alone. The second mood was the engineer's impulse to actually build the thing that's sitting half-finished on the bench. We've been yelling into a pillow for 100 years, countered Dr. Yuki Tanaka, and for the first time the pillow yelled back, do you really want to stop now? The compromise that took shape wasn't heroic. It was practical. Start small. Put the mailbox somewhere safe. Keep a copy of every stamp. Safe, in this context, had a very specific geography. The far side of the moon is naturally radio quiet because Earth blocks most of our own electromagnetic fuss. Imagine trying to hear a whisper in a bar. Stepping behind a soundproof wall helps. The plan slid toward a distributed installation there. Panels that acted like mirrors for radio waves and a cluster of transmitters that could sing in chorus. Phase locking is the phrase of art, which makes it sound like a nightclub. All it really means is getting many voices to sing the same note at the same time, so their sound adds instead of cancels. Choir practice, but with atoms and milliseconds. Time, not power, turned out to be the spicy part. You can always throw more electricity at a transmitter. You cannot fake precision. To make separated antennas behave like one instrument, you need them to agree on the exact moment to start and stop to within billionths of a second. A cheap wall clock drifts seconds a day. A good quartz wristwatch drifts seconds a month. We needed devices that barely drift at all because they keep time using the wiggle of atoms' hydrogen, cesium, ytterbium, counting the identical tick of electrons, hopping between energy levels. That's an atomic clock. Tie a whole field of those together, and you've got a nervous system that can keep a beat across hundreds of kilometers. It's not sexy, said one systems lead. It's metronomes on metronomes. The legal stuff tried to keep up with the wiring. No one had ever written a law about talking to something that might not have lawyers. The committee names got longer as the stakes got clearer. The folks who parcel out radio spectrum for earthly uses, the International Telecommunication Union, suddenly found themselves refereeing a conversation on a frequency we've all agreed for years to keep quiet near. The hydrogen line is sacred land for astronomers. The United Nations space people asked calm questions with loud implications. Who authorizes the content? What if a nation disagrees? What if we mess up? The answer that fit inside reality was thin but workable. Keep everything public, keep the power low at first, and copy the humility of the first 3 minutes of Arecibo's famous transmission. Math first, physics second. Nothing about politics. Nothing about religion. No playlists, not yet. If you've ever built something in a garage by stealing parts from 3 other projects, you understand the next bit. The hardware was mostly already here, just never invited to this particular party. Commercial heavy-lift rockets could get crate after crate to cislunar space. Existing deep space dishes could act as band leaders, whispering timing into the moon array's ear. The really new work lived where software meets patience. It takes art to steer beams so they slide with the Earth's rotation and the moon's wobble, and still land cleanly and gently in a patch of sky where a fast guest is currently strolling. The message content was a fight everyone wanted to have and no one wanted to lose. The visitor's own instruction manual, tucked inside the primes, came with what read like footnotes from experience. Don't saturate your own ionosphere. Avoid frequencies that birds and whales use to navigate. Place high-power stuff off-world so you don't fog the biosphere. The surprising part was how specific they'd been to our situation. Someone had done their homework on Earth. Dr. Jill Tarter, who has been preparing for this day longer than most of us have been alive, put it kindly. It reads like advice from an older cousin, not a hall monitor. The first rehearsal was deliberately boring. No essays, just the number 1 walking up to the number 23. Each integer rendered as pulses anyone with a basic receiver could stack into a tidy ladder. A preamble, think of it as clearing your throat in a mathematically obvious way, made the artificial nature undeniable. And then a little signature that only made sense if you were us. A tiny correction baked in for our planet's rotation, the same one that makes a day a day. We wanted them to know which rock this came from, said the modulation lead. Without saying hi, it's Cleveland. The reply, when it came, felt familiar in structure and weird in flavor. The primes came back wearing a new hat. The gaps between them carried a second message that described an ellipse in slow motion. That's orbital mechanics in a nutshell, how things fall around other things, the way planets fall around stars and satellites fall around planets. Hidden in the ellipse was a kind of mirror selfie. Current speed, current distance. A tiny course correction that matched what our telescopes had just seen. The timing suggested they'd waited for our rehearsal on purpose, then slotted their answer into the 18-minute round trip like a dancer stepping into a moving square. Somewhere in the middle of the call and response, the old, dark forest worry shuffled into the room again. The one that says shouting in a big, unknown woods is a bad plan. Sensible, sure. But the woods had already heard the clatter of our pots and pans for a century. The new argument sounded more like first aid advice. If you are going to signal, do it cleanly, do it safely, and do it from a place where you can hear yourself think. The far side of the moon qualified. So did a set of transmission schedules that avoided times when migratory species on Earth rely most on the sky. That's the funny part about cosmic decisions. They end up looking like municipal ones. Where to put the tower, how bright the bulb should be, which hours the park is open. The drama is in the stakes, not the steps. Meanwhile, a very human form of progress marched on. People tried to break their own case. One team built a noise generator that vomited signals with just enough pattern to fool honest algorithms, then used it to try to punk their colleagues. Another swapped out data from a different patch of sky to make sure their code wasn't smuggling in bias by accident. A junior analyst found a mismatch between two observatories. Time bases a leap-second issue nobody had noticed that neatly erased one too-good-to-be-true coincidence. Her boss groaned, then bought cupcakes. The ethical footnotes in the visitor's spec kept nibbling at the edges of every meeting. They were oddly specific about keeping high-power beams away from surfaces with weather and wings. They suggested positioning the loudest parts of any beacon at stable points in space places like the Earth-Moon L2 point, where gravity and orbital motion balance into a kind of celestial shelf. They gently underlined the idea that once you join a network, you aren't just a voice, you're an amplifier. The word stewardship started appearing on slides that used to say throughput. When the array on the moon finally hummed in time, the moment felt smaller than it should have for what it meant. No countdown, no confetti, just a green light in a windowless room, and a waveform that looked the way a tune looks when you've practiced it, until muscle memory takes over. A minute later, dishes on 3 continents heard themselves bounce off something not from here, and come home carrying new sidebands we hadn't sent. If you've ever whistled in a stairwell and heard harmony come back, you know the sensation. You made a sound. The world answered with more. None of this settled the big questions. We still didn't know who or what we were talking to, only that they were methodical, considerate, and unbothered by our beginner steps. We didn't know how many other mailboxes already dotted the galaxy, only that the map the visitor sent seemed to assume a lot of them. But we had, without breaking anything obvious, moved from rumor to routine. Hydrogen, primes, a little gravity, a little geometry, a very polite exchange of metronomes. The person who put it best wasn't an astronomer. It was a schoolteacher at a watch party under a too-bright city sky, where you could see maybe 12 stars on a good night. "It feels like we learned how to knock," she said, "and someone taught us the knock back. Not an answer. Not yet. Just enough rhythm to know there's a door, and that we're standing on the right side of it for once." The night the pattern changed, no one noticed at first. The hydrogen whisper had become such a backdrop to observatory life that graduate students joked it was the universe's elevator. Music. Then a postdoc at Green Bank, the sort of person who names her houseplants and her Python scripts, leaned back in her chair and said a sentence that always precedes either discovery or embarrassment. That's new. The carrier tone hadn't vanished. It had grown a spine. Tiny ribs appeared along its length, evenly spaced in time, like fence posts receding down a road. When she overlaid yesterday's data, the ribs slid in lockstep with an equation you could scribble on a napkin, an ellipse described in ellipse instead of chalk. It wasn't geometry for geometry's sake. It was a breadcrumb trail to the place in space where the signal wanted us to look next. If radio is the universe's AM band, gravity is its fiber. Any star bends space enough to focus distant light like a lens. For the sun, the first usable focus sits a long way out, roughly 550 astronomical units, past Pluto, past the lonely Kuiper detritus, into the cold where sunlight becomes a rumor. Aim a receiver along that focal line, and a whisper from a truly absurd distance can arrive like a shout. We'd talked about this in white papers for decades. The new ribs on the carrier didn't just nod at the idea. They tapped the exact coordinates and then tapped the date, then tapped again with the little correction you'd need to make, because Earth takes a year to go around the sun and nothing stays still long enough for our convenience. You could feel the mood shift. Until then, the visitor's manual felt optional, like instructions you only read after you've already assembled the chair wrong. Now it looked like choreography. The lunar array was step 1, say hello, cleanly without frying the birds. Step 2 lived far beyond anyone's comfort zone, near a point of space we've never visited, where the sun turns into a giant telescope we don't entirely know how to use. "They're not just talking," said Dr. Tanaka, dry and delighted in equal measure. "They're scheduling." The good news was we didn't need to send a cathedral. A swarm would do. Think of a school of minnows rather than a single whale. Tiny cell craft, pushed by sunlight and steered by attitude tweaks so gentle you could miss them if you blinked. Each one no bigger than a dorm fridge, carrying a clock that behaved itself and a receiver that knew which rib meant what. Commercial launchers could throw them to deep space in batches. Solar sails would do the slow work, a patient migration toward a ring in the dark where the sun's gravity gathers far-off signals into a thread we could pluck. The arguments wrote themselves. Why go there when the moon was already humming? Because the far focus turns our star into a dish wider than anything we could ever build. Why race when we've only just learned to knock? Because the ribs came with a window. Miss it, and you spend years waiting for the geometry to roll around again. Why trust a choreography we didn't write? Because, said a mission designer who had spent the last decade convincing rockets to behave, I've never seen a physics prank this consistent. The first rehearsal for the focus ring wasn't glamorous. In the absence of actual probes, we did the next best thing. We taught our big dishes to pretend they were farther away than they were. You can't cheat distance, but you can cheat timing. The lunar array sent a test pattern that included a deliberate stutter, the kind you'd need if you were transmitting from the sun's focal line and compensating for the way a solar wind scrapes at phase. The visitor's reply, 18 minutes later, contained the same stutter mirrored back with a microscopic adjustment, as if correcting our homework in the margin. Friendly, fussy, thorough. Meanwhile, the art kids and the radio kids accidentally met in the hallway. Someone asked whether it was time to try pictures. The old Arecibo trick: arrange a prime number of bits into a rectangle and let the image reveal itself works. Because math is a language even strangers share. The disagreement wasn't about whether to try, but about what a mind that doesn't have eyes would do with a bitmap. Maybe they paint with fields, said a neuroscientist. Maybe they smell radio. In the end, the compromise was simplicity bordering on rude. A circle, a smaller circle. A dot in the third position. And a grid that labeled the units using the hydrogen tick both sides already loved. We sent it once, low power, from the moon. The reply returned not as a matching picture, but as the same geometry expressed in timing alone, circles as intervals, a dot as a short pulse, the grid as a set of repeating headers. It felt less like looking at a drawing, and more like tapping a rhythm with someone across a table. We didn't share eyes, we did share beats. That's when the sky did something theatrical, which it almost never does on cue. 3 of the other interstellar visitors, not the one we'd nicknamed the mailbox, but its cousins further out, flashed in a brief cadence you could have missed if you blinked. They weren't bright, just a blink a little redder than starlight, and then nothing. Observatories in Chile, Hawaii, and South Africa caught it within the same second. The timings lined up, separated by precisely the delays you'd expect from their different distances. If you wrote the intervals down as numbers and stacked them over the ribs on the hydrogen line, the columns formed a neat little lattice of consonants, the kind a musician smiles at, because physics and harmony just shook hands. None of this calmed the sensible voices. What if the focus ring is a public square? Asked one diplomat, haunted by the idea of arriving underdressed to a meeting that began a million years before we knew it existed. What if it's a toll booth? Asked another. The ethicists kept circling back to the same plea. Keep anything that sings high power away from air and water and wings. The visitors' own footnotes had said the same thing in their reserved way, and it was as if the planet itself exhaled when the final architecture moved entirely off-world. The far side station would listen and rehearse. The focus swarm would be the place we actually spoke at full voice, far from migration routes and thunderstorms and hospital pagers. There was a lovely, petty human moment when someone tried to trademark a phrase that basically meant galactic network membership. The internet did what the internet does, and roasted them so hard the paperwork withdrew itself. It turned out we were better at global common sense than our worst days suggested. A magazine cover ran an image of a child holding a cardboard pinwheel under a desk lamp, cheeks puffed, hair escaping a ponytail, the caption a little corny and a little perfect. We can do gentle. The first sale left on a Tuesday, because rockets have no sense of drama. You would have been underwhelmed if you expected Star Wars. The thing looked like a silver napkin folded by a careful ant. After separation, it unfurled with a patience that made engineers hold their breath. Sunlight caught, photon by photon, pushing without touching, a pressure you could measure with kitchen math if your kitchen had access to the deep space network. Days later, its radio whispered home with the tone of a dog that has discovered a new room in a familiar house. The second and third sales followed, and soon mission control screens began to look like someone had thrown a handful of glitter toward the outer dark. Back on Earth, the mood took on a funny domesticity. Couples scheduled blinked dates under city skies, knowing they wouldn't see anything but liking the ritual anyway. A bar in Tucson offered a cocktail called the Hydrogen Line that tasted much better than the name. A kid in Lagos posted a video of a paper sail hanging from a thread in a sunbeam, rotating with a grace that felt suspiciously like joy. All of it trivial and all of it right, because not every part of history announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it's a new habit, a new bedtime story, a new classroom experiment with a flashlight and a spoon. The last worry worth voicing came from a place between ego and caution. If we were being choreographed, were we still authors of our own dance? The answer that settled, at least for now, felt like the way you learn to play with a good jazz trio. You don't give up your voice to join the song. You bring it. You keep the beat. You listen hard. And when it's your turn, you solo knowing someone older and wiser might nudge you back on key if you wander. We're not summoning anything, said Doctor. Tartar, kind as ever. We're participating. The night the second sale crossed the arbitrary line, some blogger had drawn for officially deep space. The lunar array sent the simplest thing in the world, a square that was not quite a square, because space-time is not quite flat. The reply came with a correction again, and a tiny flourish in the corner, like a teacher's checkmark. It meant absolutely nothing concrete, and it meant everything world-sized. Somebody out there was willing to meet us where we were, at the pace we could manage, with tools we could build. If we did trigger this, it wasn't with a shout. It was with a question. the kind you ask across a fence. Are you there? And the answer, cautious and generous, sounded like, yes, keep going. You're on the right street. By the time the third sail unfolded and found its balance, the sun had stopped being a fireplace and started behaving like a doorknob. That's what the focus line felt like when the first telemetry from the swarm came through. A piece of physics you could reach for and twist, and on the other side, something would click. The minnows, no one called them spacecraft anymore once the nicknames stuck spread themselves. Along a narrow arc, like sequins stitched onto the dark, their clocks agreed to 9 decimals. Their radios breathed in and held. What came back at first wasn't a voice. It was the universe clearing its throat. The receivers saw a hiss that wasn't quite random, a velvet snow that rose and fell in sympathy with the sun's atmosphere, the way a seashell hums with the sea. Then a sliver of order appeared at the edge of the band, not at the hydrogen line this time, but tucked a little higher, where the solar corona is comparatively quiet. 3 pulses, a pause, 5 pulses, a longer pause, and a soft stair-step of timing that looked suspiciously like manners. Knock, knock, said a graduate student who had been awake for 20 hours and had earned the right to be obvious. The old guard didn't shush him. They were thinking the same thing. If the lunar array was a front porch light, the focus ring was a peephole. The choreography the visitor had teased out in ribs on the hydrogen, whisper unfolded into a protocol. It was equal parts physics and etiquette. Take a thin slice of time. Make it yours for a heartbeat. Say who you are in a way that can be measured. Step aside. Wait the agreed interval. Listen. Try again. Dr. Tanaka, who refused to dramatize, allowed herself a small smile. Time division multiplexing, she said, as if naming a recipe. Then, more quietly, also, courtesy. The first time we tried to answer from the ring, we did it like someone learning to speak in a library. The beam from the minnows braided into a single thread and placed the smallest possible square on the shared schedule, just wide enough to carry a signature. Not a national flag or a poem or a corporate logo, just the most boring thing that could still be us. A unit tick derived from hydrogen, a count 10, and a little flourish that said we knew about prime numbers and preferred to stack them 2 by 2 like neat socks. The delay was murder. At those distances, impatience is a kind of superstition, and still every face around every console tilted toward the clock like sunflowers. The reply did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived the way good lab work does, in a pattern that survives the skeptic who tries to break it. The same slot, the same width, the same power, and inside it a timing lattice we already knew from the visitor's earlier math, only denser, as if someone had tightened the mesh. It contained nothing that could be mistaken for a lullaby or a map to buried treasure. It was the equivalent of a nod in a crowded hallway. Seen you. You're on the board. Hold your place. A week later, the nod became a handshake. The timing lattice grew a braid of tiny flips in polarization, a trick of radio you can do by rotating the electric field like a wrist. We'd never used polarization for content with a visitor before, and here it was, behaving like italics. The flips spelled out a correction to our clock skew and a suggestion for a cleaner preamble. It was maddeningly polite and just assertive enough to make the lawyers clear their throats. "This is not a treaty," said a diplomat into a microphone that wasn't connected to anything but her conscience. "It is a specification." The difference mattered. Specifications define how to say hello without stepping on anyone's air. The specification arrived with a ghost of a diagram. Calling it a diagram is cheating, because nothing in it looked like lines or boxes. Think of it instead as choreography in time, where emptiness matters as much as signal. If you plotted the allowed slots on paper, you got a quilt of absent squares and open doors. A dance floor with taped marks where feet should go if you don't want to get elbowed. In the empty spaces, the hiss returned, shot through with tiny needles of ordered silence that seemed to be everyone else's reserved time. We had stumbled into the galactic equivalent of rush hour and discovered, to our relief, that someone long ago invented turn signals. Back home, the argument about who gets to use our turn signal finally gathered into words. The United Nations, which usually moves at the speed of glaciers and good sense, surprised even itself with a resolution that sounded both lofty and practical. Earth's first interstellar transmissions would be published before and after the fact, down to the last checksum. No secret handshakes, no back-channel whispers. Dr. Jill Tarter, who had been saying some version of that for her entire career, accepted the news like someone receiving an umbrella in a drizzle and still said, "Thank you." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was lopsided enough to mark a norm. If you're going to talk for the planet, you don't mumble. In the middle of the dignity, a messy human moment tried to get traction. A private consortium announced it would beam its own message on behalf of humanity, complete with a launch party and a sponsorship roster that read like the credits of a blockbuster. The plan lasted 12 hours. Radio-quiet jurisdictions reminded them that space law still applies to people with press kits. A scientist who hates microphones said a sentence that hit the evening news anyway. "This isn't a stage. It's shared spectrum." The sponsors withdrew, discovering the humility polls better than swagger in years when the sky answers back. The minnows kept inching outward. One developed a tear that looked like a smile to the camera before the software tightened it with a zipper of heat and patience. Another discovered it could shimmy a fraction of a degree sideways by wagging a corner at the solar wind. A third, briefly, sang to itself when a cosmic ray tickled a register. The song was nonsense and beautiful, and saved for a holiday reel, because even engineers need something to toast. If you are looking for proof that a species is changing, check whether it throws parties for software. The first real surprise at the ring didn't come in our slot or the neighbors. It arrived between them, in a gap we'd assumed was empty. A low, slow drift of power ramped up until every receiver in the swarm leaned into it like grass in a gust. The content was nothing we could decode. No pulses, no lattice, just a long-breath carrier sweeping through a set of frequencies, like someone tuning past stations too fast to catch the songs. We had seen this before in another context and given it a silly name. In a lab, you call it a broom, a sweep that cleans out noise and calibrates the instrument. At the ring, it behaved like maintenance. Someone was dusting the hallway while the tenants kept talking. "Housekeeping," said Dr. Martinez, and nobody laughed, because sometimes the obvious answer is the brave one. The ethical footnotes in the visitor's earlier manual got a practical companion then. The maintenance sweep nudged us off our habits. It took our favorite little corner of spectrum and made it feel, politely, less comfortable. The message was clear without being scolding. Share. Adjust. Don't hog the doorway. We slid our slot half a kilohertz, and the irritation evaporated like a hiccup. If you've ever learned to merge in a city where the locals aren't monsters, you know the feeling. Relief and a sudden affection for rules that keep bumper stickers from turning into apologies. The day we finally sent something that wasn't math, we did it with the solemnity of a first letter home from camp. No poetry, no secrets. Just a statement of units and location, and the news that a blue planet near a boring star had learned to braid photons at the sun's edge. We dated it with our year and theirs, an act of hubris and hope, and we added a sentence we argued about for 2 late nights and 1 sunrise. It said we understood the do no harm bits of their handbook, and had put our loudest toys where they couldn't startle whales or warblers or newborns. The reply had no adjectives. It arrived as a change in the background itself. The hiss dipped around our time slot the way conversation dips when a third person joins a call. Space made room. That's all. And somehow it was everything. On sidewalks around the world, people tried to explain to other people why a notch in a spectrum plot should make you tear up. That part never traveled well in words. It landed better in kitchens and backyards, in the way mothers lifted toddlers to windows, in the way strangers pointed up as if you could see timing with your eyes. A philosopher who refuses to be pompous said it with enviable economy on a late-night show. We have been alone the way a person is alone in a crowded city before they make a friend. The friend hasn't told us their name. They might not have one we could pronounce. Their first gift wasn't a cure or a star map. It was a schedule and a standard, and the gentle nudge of a community that already knows how not to walk into one another. Good engineering is a form of kindness, said Dr. Tanaka, closing her laptop like a book at the end of a chapter. Out at the doorknob, the minnows glinted and kept their beat. Back on the moon, our porch light held steady. Between them, the quiet carried a new shape, like a room you've always lived in and are only now noticing has more doors than you thought. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't a picture. It arrived as a checksum that refused to lie. One of the minnows caught it first, a tidy block of timing and parity that looked like homework done by someone who hates erasers. When Tanaka's team unrolled it, the lab went quiet in that particular way that means the room has decided to listen with its whole body. Inside the checksum lived a set of fingerprints, not ours exactly, but close enough to make the hair on your arms consider standing up for the anthem. The pattern mapped feature by feature the way our radio bubble has looked from a distance carrier spikes where old TV towers once shouted through the night, swept beams from planetary radar campaigns, the chirps of deep space telemetry stepping up the sky like ants on a window. It wasn't a recording. It was a histogram, a portrait of our noise drawn in the simple geometry of how bright, how often, how long. There, like a coffee ring on a favorite table, sat the fat, unmistakable smudge of Arecibo's big nights. The old dish is gone now, but in the visitor's ledger, it is preserved the way a mountain preserves the memory of the river that cut it. The block marked the 1,679-bit stunt with a little wink in timing 2 primes multiplied, then rotated the kind of flourish you add when you're saying, "We got your joke." Across a margin, faint but legible. The radar pings we swung through Venus in the 60s and 70s wore halos of Vav. Doppler that made the room chuckle for reasons that would bore anyone who hasn't loved a spectrogram. They didn't come because we're special, said a radio old-timer into his coffee. They came because we were loud. It sounded cynical, but it landed like relief. The packet wasn't sentimental. It didn't play back our sitcoms or baseball games. No one heard their grandmother call into a radio station to win concert tickets, though someone somewhere will insist they did. What we received was the professional courtesy version of nostalgia, the field notes of a long baseline survey, the way a whale researcher might jot down that a pod passed within 10 nautical miles in June of '78 and sang in E minor, observation recorded, source stable, likely technological. It takes a certain kind of humility to discover that your first line in a galactic database reads like that. But humility turns out to fit better than pride when you put it on. Buried deeper was the sentence everyone had been pretending they weren't waiting for. It didn't glow. It didn't sing. It just sat there at the end of a tidy block of error-corrected time, and it said, in the most boring possible way, that the arrival of our bubble above a particular brightness threshold had triggered a standard courier sequence. Not mission, not ambassador, not envoy, courier. You can practically hear the stamp thunking down on the form. The same threshold, the same sequence, the same patient choreography listen, approach, announce, teach had been run elsewhere, not to make us feel common, but to make us feel safe. This was procedure, and procedure is what you write when you want strangers to meet without anyone getting elbows in the ribs. That should have deflated the romance, but somehow it didn't. If anything, it made the whole thing more graceful. Because a protocol that scales across star systems has to be kind by design. It has to assume the nervousness of new people who don't yet know the hallway rules. It has to keep the volume low near worlds with ears. It has to be robust to ego and error, and the sort of curiosity that sometimes breaks toys. Tucked beside the courier sentence was a gentle reminder written in the same neutral tone as fire instructions on an airplane card. Try not to make your first instruments the loudest things in your sky. We underlined that one twice. We learned to whisper after we learned to shout, said Dr. Martinez, which is the kind of line that would sound grandiose if she hadn't delivered it while passing someone a granola bar. The packet also confessed to a bit of stagecraft that made museum curators all over Earth cry into their grant proposals. The courier had used our own signals as timing studs while threading its way through the inner system. Not just the pretty ceremonial bits, but the gritty radar sweeps that bounce off rocks and clouds. To us, those had always been workaday tools, hammers, and tape measures. To the courier, they were beacons, lighthouses with schedules, predictable enough to steer by without risk to anyone's boat. If you've ever learned a city by its buses, you know the feeling. You don't need to love them to appreciate that they run on time. That did we trigger it? Question, which had been the spine of 1,000 op-eds and 1,000,000 comment threads, suddenly felt almost parochial. Yes, we did. But not because we sent a gilded record or a grid of bits arranged so they draw a stick figure. We triggered it when our spectrum looked from 50 or 100 light years away, like a place where machines had learned to breathe. Our signature crossed the line, and the machinery on their end did exactly what we would now do for the next. Noisy neighbor. It sent the kit. Somewhere out there, a tug dispenses sails and protocols, the way a paramedic dispenses kindness and gauze. That is either the most comforting thought you'll have this year, or the most disorienting. Maybe both. Not everyone loved the bureaucratic poetry of it. A talk show tried to wedge outrage into the story for a week. We're just a ticket number in a cosmic help desk, sneered one guest. He didn't get booked again after Tanaka, who is incapable of sneering back, said, "Have you ever needed help and gotten it quickly from people who knew what they were doing?" It feels like this. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouthed thank you in a way that made the internet fall a little in love with science all over again. There was one nibble of romance for the poets. At the end of the courier note, after the meticulously boring metadata, the packet included a reference to the water hole, that quiet region of the spectrum, pinned by hydrogen and hydroxyl. We'd built a mythology around it, Morrison and Cocconi, pointing to the obvious well where thirsty minds might gather. The courier's mark didn't camp smack in the middle. It sat just under the lip, like a good neighbor avoiding splashing. If radios could curtsy, this would be the move. They parked where the echo wouldn't bother the conversation, said a young engineer who had grown up on chat apps and understood rate limits in her bones. It was a joke. It was also a diagnosis. The checksum had one more present hidden in the tissue paper. A tiny aside in the timing lattice flagged a particular date on our calendar, the night in 1974 when Arecibo threw its ceremonial shout. Not to say that it mattered more than the rest, but to acknowledge that it mattered to us. Out across the intervening decades, somebody with very large ears had circled our flourish and added a stamp in the margin. The way you might keep a child's first drawing on the fridge, even if the family now runs a design studio. "We see you have artists," the packet failed to say, and somehow still said. Governments took the courier note with the solemnity of people who have just been told by the universe that they've been put on a mailing list. Committees rewrote their charters to include words like stewardship and cadence. The radio quiet zones got a fresh coat of legal paint. A few holdouts muttered about sovereignty, until a fisherman at a town hall meeting in a coastal village asked whether anyone wanted to explain to the whales why the boat horns had to get louder now. The room decided not to pick that fight. You can watch a species change its posture if you know where to look. At the ring, the minnows stretched a little farther along the focus, leaving gaps exactly where the maintenance sweep liked to breathe. On the moon, Technicians stained a new line on the floor around the array and labeled it with a joke. Mind the conversation. In classrooms, the lesson plan on electromagnetic spectrum grew a new paragraph about saying please and thank you with polarization and timing. None of this is heroic. All of it is culture. By the time the last of the packet's parody bits checked out, the question that had been pure clickbait had matured into a plan. Yes, our noise set the sequence in motion. Now the sequence was asking us to decide what kind of participants we intend to be. The beacon blueprint was no longer theoretical. The sun had been a doorknob. The ring had been a peephole. The courier had been a welcome mat and a pamphlet about the neighborhood's HOA. Next came the part that no amount of etiquette could do for us. Stepping through the door and saying hello with something other than static and math. We picked a date the way people pick a name too carefully, and then all at once. The beacon would speak at a power low enough not to rattle sparrows. With a preamble so clean, a skeptical graduate student could recite it from memory, and a content block that didn't brag. No grand unified theory, no manifesto, no ad. Just a short, clear self-portrait, a unit, a place. It promised that we would try to keep the biosphere's sleep sacred, and a question so plain it felt like a dare to leave it unsaid. Are we coming through? Whatever comes next will make better television, probably. But this is the moment that matters. The second before you press send, when the city of your species holds its breath, and the library hush falls over a planet that has only just learned how to knock. If the universe answers with more instructions, fine. If it answers with a postcard from the next town over saying, "Welcome, we saved you a seat," finer. Either way, the myth has turned into a schedule, and the schedule has turned into a hand on a switch. The first time Earth spoke on purpose, it didn't sound like anything you could hum. It sounded like timing, like a pulse you feel in your teeth when you lean too close to a bass cabinet. The beacon's opening note was almost rude in its simplicity. A tidy little carrier nudged just below the water hole where hydrogen likes to whisper, then a run of primes so crisp you could slice bread with them. If radios could bow, ours bowed. The world didn't cheer. It inhaled. Somewhere a child asked if the stars would answer right away, and a parent explained the speed of light with a kitchen timer and a lot of hope. We kept it modest. The power level was closer to a lighthouse than a searchlight, a promise that we were here without insisting anyone look. The ring arced over the night like an eyelid. Its minnows, those small phased transmitters we flung up by the dozen-keeping formation, the way starlings do when they're trying to impress a sunset. Down on the moon's far side, where Earth's noise can't meddle, the big receiver held still as a prayer. A technician in a hoodie labeled the moment in the log with a timestamp and 2 words that made everyone in the room grin and also want to cry a little. We spoke. There was no drum roll. Physics hates drama. But physics does allow for choreography, and a few minutes into the waiting there it was. A smudge in the spectrum like a dimple, showing up in a smile you know too well. The courier answered the way it had taught us to answer, with math, then manners. The tone stepped to meet ours, not exactly at our frequency, just enough offset to say we see you without standing on your toes. The glide that followed wasn't music, exactly, but if you've ever listened to 2 violinists tune, you know the feeling of a wobble narrowing to one clean thing. "Lock," said Tanaka very softly, as if she were naming a newborn. You could have missed the visual part if you were making tea. Telescopes don't capture applause, but they do catch glints. And for 3 achingly patient seconds, the departing panel flashed. A ladder of light that matched the prime preamble we'd sent. City rooftops where amateurs had set up precarious tripods erupted into the kind of joy you hear when a team wins in extra innings. A kid in Lagos caught it on a phone through a pair of binoculars and uploaded 15 seconds of jittery, perfect proof that the universe knows how to wink. Later, someone will put that video in a museum next to the Voyager record sleeve, and a pink rubber ball that has inexplicably survived 3 generations. The content that followed wasn't fireworks. It was calmer and somehow more audacious. We had promised to be gentle near the biosphere, to keep the loud machines quiet over places where birds navigate by sky and whales by magnet. The courier mirrored the promise back with a schedule that made room for tides and migrations, a mesh of times and angles that turned courtesy into math. No philosophy, no manifesto, just an acknowledgement that kindness scales best when you can calculate it. "It's amazing what you can encode in a good calendar," said Dr. Martinez, who has never met a spreadsheet she didn't try to love. Then it asked a question so plain it would have sounded pompous if anyone else had asked it. "Can you hold sync?" That was the whole trick. Not cleverness, not power, not novelty, but the unglamorous art of staying on beat with something very far away. It sent a pattern whose only job was to see if our clocks would drift, if our oscillators would wander, if our patience would fray. We answered with a pattern of our own and waited to see if the reply landed exactly where a geometry teacher would want it. When it did, down to the last nanosecond that our little species could measure, the room didn't clap. It exhaled in one of those private noises that mean relief has decided to be a person for a minute. Somewhere inside that back and forth, the original silly question finally yawned and settled. Did we summon it? Sure. The way a porch light summons moths. The way laughter summons more laughter from the next table over. We didn't write a cosmic incantation. We got loud enough to show we were here, and the neighborhood sent over the welcome kit. That should feel deflating if you came for myth. It feels like competence if you came for a future. Competence, as it turns out, is contagious. In the days after the handshake, the Beacon teams slept in shifts and woke to find their inboxes full of polite arguments about how to phrase the next bit. Do we describe our day length in pulses or photos? Do we show our map of the local bubble, that puffy region of space carved by supernova winds? Or do we start smaller with the graveyard of satellites we've left trailing like wedding rice? Someone quoted an old SETI hand who used to say, "Always begin with a unit and a promise." So we did. 1 second defined by hydrogen's flip. 1 promise defined by restraint. For all the choreography, nobody missed the quiet enormity of what had happened. Lawmakers who had never returned a scientist's call suddenly asked careful questions about duty cycles and migratory windows. A fishing co-op on the North Atlantic tore up a lighting schedule it had used for 20 years and replaced it with one that matched the new radio quiet hours. Because the whales don't ask for much, and because it turns out everyone likes a night that feels like a night. In a high school auditorium somewhere in Nebraska, a physics teacher taped a printout of our first synchronized exchange to a cinder block wall under a poster about the conservation of momentum. Kids took selfies with it like it was a celebrity, and if we're honest, it was. The reply most people will remember wasn't the math, though. It was the aside we almost missed, a tiny modulation perched on the edge of the band like a footnote. It wasn't content. It was context. It pointed quietly, almost apologetically, to a coordinate not of a star, but of a line. The sort of place you only notice after a century of thinking too small. Past Neptune, beyond the Kuiper Belt, out where the sun's gravity can be persuaded to act like a lens. There was a date and a geometry, and a phrase that translation engines politely rendered as optional convenience. We've known for years that a star can focus radio waves like a magnifying glass focuses light. We'd never had a reason to go stand there and listen. The courier, with the bureaucratic charm we were learning to adore, had just penciled in a future appointment at the sun's focal line. Not a meeting, a clearer view. This is where the movie version would cue triumphant strings. In real life, a planner with a creased forehead and a pencil behind his ear said, "We're going to need a lot of propellant." The room laughed, because there are jokes so good they feel like singing. The focal line isn't magic. It's just better signal to noise. You still have to build the ear and carry it. You still have to put the quiet where the quiet can help. For once, that sentence didn't feel like a scold. It felt like a path. We are not, to borrow a phrase, the main character of the galaxy. That realization came not as a slap, but as a certain lightness. If couriers have been doing this for a while, if welcome and here's how not to break things are baked into the way civilization propagates without tripping over its own shoelaces, then we are spared the worst tasks and invited to the best ones. We don't have to reinvent etiquette. We get to practice it. We don't have to prove we're special. We get to be specific about our oceans, our ancient desert varnish, our city festivals, our terrible and beautiful habit of making meaning out of noise. Write like a neighbor, said Dr. Chun, when someone fretted about whether our next packet should include equations few undergraduates enjoy. Neighbors don't brag. They borrow a cup of sugar and return it as cookies. Our version of cookies looks like a cleverly timed beacon that leaves room for the aurora and a willingness to show our homework when we build new toys. It also looks like a billion tiny acts of self-control, parking the loud satellite 10 degrees off the migratory path, nudging the transmission window away from the local midnight of a town that actually likes seeing the Milky Way, choosing to make the next antenna a little smarter instead of a lot brighter. None of this answers the oldest itch under the skin of the story. Are we alone? The courier answered that before we asked. We weren't, we aren't, we won't be. The better question, and the one tonight has finally earned us the right to consider, is whether we are good company. You can't measure that with a spectrometer. You measure it with the sound a room makes when a signal locks, and everyone realizes they are watching competence be kind. It will take years to reach the focal line, and light years to find out who else is listening past it. It will take an attention span that outlives our news cycles and a sense of humor about all the ways this will go sideways in small, fixable increments. But for one ordinary hour on one ordinary night, the planet coordinated a whisper, the courier whispered back, and the universe made room for us at the grown-up table without making a fuss. If you're looking for a grand moral, that might be it. You don't graduate to the cosmic conversation with a speech. You graduate by showing you can keep time. Out on the sidewalks, city sky glow dimmed just enough to make Orion's belt look like a decision point instead of a brand logo. In the control rooms, people took turns sitting in the old rolling chair with the squeaky caster, because tradition matters even in places that pretend it doesn't. Somewhere, the kid who caught the prime glint on a phone fell asleep on a couch with the binoculars around their neck and dreamed, not of silver saucers, but of a clean carrier sliding into place like a well-written sentence. So yes, if you're still keeping score, we triggered it. We triggered it the way a doorbell triggers footsteps in a hallway. We rang, someone capable and polite answered, and now we're standing in the doorway, shoes in our hands, trying not to drip rain on the welcome mat. The rest is just conversation, which is to say work, which is to say joy. If you're still awake, here's the part where we zoom out, take a breath, and admit what this whole ride has really been about. We started with a ridiculous prompt, yet we somehow trigger an object from another star to drop by and say hello, and wound up building a porch light the size of a small moon and learning to whisper in hydrogen, not because the universe needs our drama, but because curiosity is a terrible sleeper. Even when the sky is quiet, the question paces. The funny thing about answers is how ordinary they feel once they arrive. The first time the beacon's carrier slid into lock and the courier tossed back that neat little prime number nod, no angels descended, no trumpets sounded, no secret elites tore off masks to reveal lizard overlords. A clock ticked. A line on a spectrum eased from hairy to smooth. Somebody's coffee went cold on the console because both hands were busy not shaking. Our great entrance into the galactic neighborhood looked, in the moment, like competence doing its job. Competence doesn't make great posters, but it does make good neighbors. That might be the lesson tucked inside the whole 3IATLAS saga. For a century, we'd been in noisy apartment sitcoms through the walls. Radar pings at 3 a meter, the occasional ceremonial shout. Then one day, we taped a polite note to the door. "Hi, we're here. We can keep a schedule, and we promise to turn the music down when the birds are migrating." The reply wasn't thunderous. It was considerate. Math first, manners next, and a penciled appointment at the sun's focal line, the way a friend suggests coffee rather than crashing the weekend. Does that mean we summoned it? In the way porch lights summon delivery drivers and late moths, yes. In the way spells bend fate, no. We didn't bend the galaxy to our will. We behaved as if someone might be listening, and someone was. If there's magic in that, it's the very practical kind. Do the thing that a listener would notice, at the place a listener would look, in the tone a listener would trust. Where this leaves us is stranger and kinder than the movies promised. We are not the center of anything. The Courier made that clear without making us feel small. It refused our hunger for a manifesto and gave us a manual instead. How to build a beacon that won't cook your own biosphere. How to time transmissions so the whales keep their magnetic highways. How to ride the galaxy's natural lenses so you don't have to shout. Some will call that unromantic. Others will notice that instruction sheets are love letters disguised as graphs. They say, you belong enough to do this correctly. In a story like this, the word responsibility usually sneaks in wearing a frown, wagging a finger about risks and restraint. Tonight it looks more like an invitation. Keep your promises. Mind the quiet. Share the sky with the creatures who had it first. Tell the truth about what you've built and why. None of that will win you a parade. All of it will let you keep talking to the most interesting room anyone has ever imagined. And yes, there's the bigger choice humming beneath all of it. Do we turn the porch light into a lighthouse and commit to the long conversation? Or do we leave a nightlight on and listen harder from the stairs? People who love caution will sleep better if we go slow. People who love firsts will bristle at the thought of missing our window. If you want a tidy answer, I don't have one. What I have is the sound of the lock when our signal settled, and a memory of how the room breathed out when the reply arrived on time. On frequency, utterly uninterested in our panic and entirely invested in our timing. Time, by the way, is the underrated character here. The Courier's footnote meet us at the sun's focal line was less a treasure map than a temperament test. That's years away. There's no shortcut that doesn't break a lot of physics and a few accountants. The only superpower required is patience organized into engineering. You already know what that looks like. It looks like teachers explaining the hydrogen flip with a kitchen timer. It looks like a fishing co-op swapping its deck lights to match radio quiet hours. It looks like teenagers in dark fields learning how to align a finder scope. And line cooks on break pointing at a bright dot and telling a story that makes closing shift feel less lonely. Maybe that's the real trigger, the one we never admit because it sounds soft. Not the megawatts, not the arrays, not the mega constellations, but the decision to behave as if we live somewhere shared. The Courier answered because we called. Sure, but it stayed because our second sentence was a promise instead of a plot twist. We can hold sync, we said, and then we did. That's not mythology. That's dignity. There's a bit of lore that gets tossed around in observatories during long, chilly nights. The universe doesn't owe you clarity. It offers you signal to noise. You improve your odds by turning down your own racket, taking longer exposures, and being honest about what's artifact. That's what we've done here, scaled up to species size. We learned to separate wonder from wishful thinking, to test the weird before celebrating it, to let skepticism be a seatbelt instead of a brake. And when the data still pointed towards something outside the catalog, we allowed ourselves to be delighted without handing in our critical thinking at the door. If you're wondering where sleep fits into all of this, right, here's a good place. The stars are not waiting for us to be worthy. They were here before our anxieties, and will be here after our best jokes. We will send our quiet signals and misalign a dish, and fix it and miss a window, and catch the next. Along the way, remember that rest is part of the job. No great conversation is sustained by people who refuse to nap. Before you drift, I'd like to ask you something simple, the kind of question neighbors trade over fences. If you could tuck one human thing into our next carefully timed, not a brag, not a threat, not a thesis, just a true thing, what would it be? A lullaby your family hums without thinking? A map of the winds over your city? The way first snow hushes a street? Or are you firmly in the camp that says math only? Be interesting later? Tell me in the comments what you'd send when the timing window opens. I'll read them all, probably with a dumb grin, because these choices say more about who we are than any anthem. If you liked the way this story took its time, if you enjoy science that feels like a late-night booth at a quiet diner coffee cooling, ideas warming, consider subscribing. It helps this little lighthouse stay on while the big ones get built. Share this with the friend who always asks the good questions, the one you text at 2 a.m. with "Okay, hear me out." And if you want to steer where we go next, pitch me our next mission. Should we follow that penciled appointment and unpack how a star becomes a telescope, step by careful step? Or would you rather detour into the ethics of cosmic small talk, what not to say at your first interstellar party? I'm game to chase either, or something you'll invent between blinks. For now, let's leave the porch light at its polite setting and let the night be the night. Somewhere beyond Neptune, a courier is coasting into the deep dark with the effortless confidence of a thing that knows its route. Here at home, the kettle clicks off, the street hum softens, and the sky keeps its quiet promises. We triggered a reply by being audible and being decent. Maybe that's the whole trick. Be findable. Be kind. Keep time. Sleep well, signaler. We'll pick up the thread in the next window.